Chapter 220:41. The Harder They Fall. The roof of the great tower was flat, with a low parapet running around its perimeter. The stones were slick and wet, covered in water. The sky above was dark with storm clouds, and torrential rain pelted everything with a primal fury. The winds here were strong as well, howling as they strained to push anyone foolish enough to ascend the tower down into a fatal fall. It really seemed like the heavens had burst open, unleashing a world-ending flood. The flying vehicle, a helicopter, stood in the middle of the roof, and Madoc was standing in front of it. Sonny was not sure what a helicopter was supposed to look like, really, but he was pretty sure that it was not supposed to be on fire, tilted to one side and spouting billowing pillars of acrid black smoke. Huh? Just as Sonny leaped over the last few steps of the long staircase, feeling his leg muscles burning, there was a bright flash. A second later, a blinding bolt of lightning struck the burning machine, sending a swarm of sparks flying in all directions. Madoc staggered back, covering his face with an arm. Sonny froze for a split second. Well. He remembered the previous bolts of lightning that had landed somewhere above them during the battle for the courtyard. Back then, he did not waste any time thinking where they had hit. But really, it made sense. This was the highest point of the castle, and there was nothing around them but the vast expanse of the lake. Naturally, lightning would be attracted to a huge machine made of metal standing on an elevated point. It seemed that whoever the other Mordred had paid to design this helipad was terrible at their job. Sonny was not going to complain, though. It was high time for him to get a little lucky. Now, at least, the enemy was not going to escape at the last moment. Raising his revolver, Sonny aimed it at the chairman of the Valor Group, Freeze. Madoc spun around, piercing him with an infuriated gaze. You vermin. Anger, indignation, humiliation. There were a lot of hues to his voice, but remorse was not one of them. Even now that he had nowhere else to run, he was not sorry for what he had done. He was only sorry about getting caught. Outraged by it, really. Hearing his companions catching up, Sonny smiled darkly and said in a cold, even tone, "Mr. Madoc, you are under arrest." The wind howled louder as he said those words. Ah, it feels good. Sonny was not the devil detective. Still, he had walked a mile in the troubled detective's shoes and had experienced his obsessive determination to bring the nihilist to justice, even if it meant going against the omnipotent Valor Group. The nihilist did not really exist, but his victims had not become less real because of that. 7 people had been brutally murdered, and now the man responsible for their deaths was standing in front of him. Even if both the victims and the killer were not real people, and the details of the case had simply been concocted by the Castellan, it still felt good to solve it. Looking at Madoc, Sonny felt a strange sense of accomplishment. Madoc, meanwhile, snarled. "Arrest me?" He laughed. "Sure, go ahead. Arrest me. Let us see if there is an attorney in this city who dares to prosecute me, or a judge who dares to convict me." Sonny's smile turned darker still. "You know, Mr. Madoc, it's not very wise to boast about something like that to a man aiming a gun at you." At that moment, Effie and the rest finally arrived. Saint appeared on the roof last, looking even more haggard than she had in the throne room. Madoc's eyes widened a little when he saw Morgan. Then he froze and scowled when 2 versions of Mordred came into view. "What is this?" Taking a step back, Madoc rubbed his eyes and stared at the 2 identical men once more. For a moment he glanced unsure of himself, but then his expression returned to normal. He seemed to have come up with some kind of explanation to resolve the maddening contradiction of the world. "Ranu? A stand-in? Ha! I should have known." The other Mordred sighed. "Uncle." His expression was troubled. Just as Sonny was satisfied with finally catching the true culprit behind the nihilist killings, the other Mordred must have felt the opposite. The Castellan had changed the background of Mirage City to cater to its new guests, but by doing so, the truth familiar to its sole permanent inhabitant had also been changed. Perhaps the other Mordred wanted to tell his uncle that it was not his fault. After all, Madoc had not been a murderous conspirator just a few days ago. He had been made into the mastermind of the nihilist murders by the Castellan. But what was the point? Saying something like that meant admitting that Madoc was not a real person, and if he was not a real person, telling him anything had no point. The other Mordred seemed to be caught in this bitter contradiction, not knowing what to say. His counterpart, however, had no such problem. As Madoc backed away, Mordred took a step forward and smiled. Ah. As much as it pains me to admit, I am starting to see the allure of living in this sweet illusion. I was denied the pleasure of killing Whispering Blade with my own 2 hands, but now the Great Mirror is offering me another chance. Of course, it is not exactly the real deal, but beggars can't be choosers, can we? Madoc's back met the parapet, and he looked back with a wary expression. Well played, nephew. Well played. You drove me into a corner. I hope you don't think that I'm out of cards, though, police, really? Do you really think that you can bring me down with just that? Mordred's smile just widened slightly. Effie stared at his back for a moment, then turned to Sonny with a confused expression. All right, we got him. But what do we do with him now? How are we going to lure out the Castellan? Sonny frowned. That was a good question indeed, I think. But before he could answer, Mordred finally reached the reflection of his uncle. Without saying anything else or changing his expression, he calmly raised a hand and pushed Madoc over the parapet. Everything happened so swift that none of them managed to react in time. By the time the other Mordred flinched and Morgan took an involuntary step forward, Madoc was already gone from view. A panicked scream resounded from the darkness, muffled by the howling of the wind and the roaring thunder. Half a dozen seconds later, the scream was cut abruptly somewhere far below. Mordred dusted off his hands and turned to them with a pleasant smile. Well, that's taken care of. For some reason, Sonny did not like the look of his smile. Am I missing something? He scowled, trying to understand why he was suddenly feeling uneasy. Surely, it was not because of Madoc's death. The only surprising thing about it was that it had come abruptly and without warning. He had not really expected Madoc to survive to begin with. However, before Sonny could finish the thought, he was interrupted once again. This time it was because of a low rumbling sound that suddenly washed over them, shaking the very foundations of the world. Chapter 242, Flowing Water. A distant rumbling roar washed over the world, making it seem as if everything had gone still for a moment. It sounded like an enormous beast was stirring awake somewhere far away, rising from its slumber as forests and mountains rolled off its broad shoulders. There was a flash of lightning. Half blinded by the rain, Sonny unconsciously took a step toward the parapet. The others did the same, all looking in a single direction with tense, confused expressions toward the source of the rumbling sound. They were facing north. What? Effie's voice drowned in a deafening thunderclap. Sonny inhaled sharply. Somehow he knew what had happened, and what was going to happen as well. The world was dark, obscured by the heavy storm clouds. Still, some light penetrated their thick barrier, and Mirage City was enveloped in a dim twilight. The restless surface of the Mirror Lake was stirring in front of them, and beyond it, the great mass of the drowning city sprawled on the distant shore. Beyond the city were the mountains and the ancient barrier of the northern dam. That dam was breaking apart now, unable to endure the crushing weight of the artificial lake hidden behind it. It had held proud for thousands of years, withstanding the ruthless tyranny of time and the fierce assaults of natural forces. But it had not been able to withstand human corruption. The subpar renovation works perpetrated by the Valor Group on Madoc's orders had compromised its integrity, and the disastrously persistent rains had caused the great reservoir contained by the dam to swell uncontrollably, pushing it to and over the limit. And now it could not hold any longer. Sonny's eyes widened as he watched the calamity unfold. At first it was a single crack that appeared on the great dam. The floodgates had already been opened to relieve the pressure, with foaming torrents of water pouring down from a vast height. However, that was not enough. The crack split the dam from top to bottom, spreading across its surface with the speed of lightning. It was narrow and barely noticeable, almost impossible to see. However, a second later, that small crack became a devastating breach. The still water of the reservoir had become an unstoppable monster, wielding power so awful that millions of tons of stone and concrete were flung outward as if shot from a cannon. The entire middle section of the dam exploded, with giant chunks of stone flying into the outskirts of the city below and crushing residential buildings as if they were paper boxes. What followed the annihilating debris was much worse, though. Sonny froze, enthralled by the distressing visage and unable to move. His companions were motionless as well, witnessing the scene of utter destruction in a deafening silence. The water roared as it escaped its prison. It rushed through the wide breach in the damaged dam like a living being, hungering for human souls. The titanic torrent was too vast for its scale to be fathomed, or for its force to be measured. Looking at it, Sonny felt something that he had not felt in a long time. The utter frightening awe that mortals felt in the face of the insurmountable power that dwarfed their very existence. The terrifying power of hostile, untamed nature. The torrent of water hit the outskirts of Mirage City and swallowed them whole, flowing far and wide to consume everything in sight. The buildings, the streets, the rushing PTVs, the tiny figures of the terrified people, all of it was washed away in an instant, crushed and broken ground into nothingness, and drowned in the foaming expanse of raging water. Of course, the flood did not stop there. The powerful current rushing through the breach in the dam did not weaken. On the contrary, as more of the dam collapsed, it became more potent. The great tidal wave that had swallowed the outskirts continued south, devastating the northern areas of Mirage City. The rivers running toward the Mirror Lake swelled and overflowed, escaping their beds. Their flooding caused by that was merely a promise of the imminent disaster, though. All across the city, the heavy iron covers of the drainage pipes were sent flying into the air. Towering plumes of foaming water shot upward like geysers. It was only then that the thunderous roar of the collapsing dam reached the distant parts of Mirage City, and people on the streets froze in place, looking north with confused expressions. The flood utterly crushed and destroyed the northernmost parts of Mirage City. However, the rest of it was not spared either. Even if the obliterating force of the tidal wave had been exhausted as it moved further away from the broken dam, the water still continued flowing. In the districts north of Mirror Lake, the water flowed freely across the streets, rising higher and higher. It swallowed the PTVs and the pedestrians, collecting an unimaginable death toll. Some of the buildings were partially flooded, some even submerged in the water completely. The citizens trapped in them had not survived either. Standing by Sonny's side, Effie let out a strange cry and grabbed the parapet, her fingers turning white. Finally, the flood reached the Mirror Lake. It stopped the torrent for a while. However, the level of water in the lake rapidly rose. Soon enough, the slopes of the mountain and the stone steps leading to the castle disappeared beneath the surging waves, leaving only the platform directly in front of the great gates above the tide. By then, the Mirror Lake had overflowed as well. A secondary wave poured from the confines of its shores, joining the flood as it rushed south. The narrow streets there funneled the water, giving the torrents more strength. Nothing could withstand the terrible force of the flowing water, and everyone who had been looking north minutes earlier drowned with terrified expressions on their faces, unable to escape. Everything in sight had drowned in the vast, unstoppable current. Sonny had seen this scene before. He had seen it innumerable times. Every time the night came to the forgotten shore, the dark sea would flood the crimson labyrinth and destroy anything and anyone who had not found shelter from its fury. Only, this time, it was not abominations that were being destroyed by the rushing water, it was people. Nier men, the streets of Mirage City become their watery grave. Something like that must have happened in the true Bastion as well, thousands of years ago. Soon enough, the Mirror Lake seemed to have expanded greatly, growing to cover the entire area where Mirage City had once stood. Here and there, the edifices of skyscrapers rose from the water like orphaned towers, but most of the city was hidden under the mass of water, at the heart of the great lake. The castle stood lonesomely among the waves. The other Mordred swayed as he took a step back. His expression at the moment was hard to describe, even if someone was in a state to pay attention to such details. Everyone seemed stunned and petrified by what they had just witnessed. Except for Sonny. Sonny, on the contrary, was restless. "I missed it. I missed it. Damn it. How could I have been so foolish? How could I have been fooled again?" While everyone stood still, he suddenly spun around and raised his revolver, aiming it at Mordred's head. Sonny then gritted his teeth and pressed the trigger. Chapter 2543, Double Cross. It was impossible to dodge a bullet, for a mundane human at least. And yet that was exactly what Mordred did. He had been looking at the harrowing sight of the drowning city with the rest of them a split second ago. But when Sonny's revolver thundered, aimed at his head point blank, he leaned sideways with superhuman speed, allowing the bullet to fly past. Damn it. Mordred took a step back, coming to stand near his other fragment. The first to react was Saint, even if she only turned to look in his direction. Morgan and Effie spun around, wary and trying to understand what had happened. The other Mordred was the last to realize what had happened, reeling back in shock. Mordred reached a hand and grabbed his arm, preventing him from losing his balance. "Goodness gracious, Sunless, what was that for?" His smile was as pleasant as ever, but it did not reach his eerie, mirror-like eyes. Sonny gritted his teeth. That was to slow you down. He knew, of course, that simply shooting Mordred was not going to kill him, but it was bound to destroy his body and force him to search for a new one. In fact, I should have aimed for the other one. Sonny belatedly realized that he had made a mistake, but there was no time to feel regret. He finally realized the source of the feeling that he was missing something that had been plaguing him ever since the throne room. Sadly, it was already too late. His hands are clean. When Mordred descended from the gallery, his hands were bloodied, but now they were clean. It was a small detail that would not have mattered in most circumstances, but held a frightening meaning here in Mirage City. Sonny had failed to register the fact completely. But just now, as they were watching the city drown, he saw something in the periphery of his vision. It was so subtle that he paid it no attention at first, yet his subconscious kept pushing the thought of it to the forefront of his mind. That something was a thin tendril of white mist, almost impossible to see in the heavy rain. It flowed from below the parapet and slowly reached Mordred, and was absorbed into his body. That white mist was the essence of the other who had played the role of Madoc before being killed by the Prince of Nothing. The body had fallen all the way down to the courtyard, shattering as it crashed into the roofs of the main keep first. It had taken the mist quite some time to reach all the way to the highest point of the great tower, Aen's Ag. That was probably the very reason why Mordred had chosen to kill Madoc by pushing him down. The body was gone now, just like the bodies of the rest slain by Saint disappeared without a trace. That was why the blood was gone from Mordred's hands. The corpses of the mercenaries he had killed dissolved into mist, and their blood followed. I should have realized sooner. Sonny cursed himself bitterly. It made so much sense in hindsight. There were too many strange things about the Palace of Imagination, so, overwhelmed by them, he had not thought about the reason why Saint was able to absorb the ghostly essence of reflections in detail. The answer was obvious, though. It was because she had an affinity to Nothing, and who had the same affinity as well. It was Mordred, the Prince of Nothing, and the other Mordred, too. The latter had spent most of his life in Mirage City, but unlike his ruthless alter ego, he was not a murderous fiend. There had been no reason for him to kill anyone, and even if there had been, he wouldn't have. That was simply out of character for him. So even after spending decades in the Palace of Imagination, he had never absorbed Nothing, and had never regained his awakened power. But Mordred was different. Slaughtered the mercenaries and killed Madoc. Gods only knew how many the rest he had slain before meeting Sonny, which meant that he had at least some of his power back and had been hiding it, and that did not bode well. It did not bode well at all. Mordred laughed. It seems that I've been caught." Effie studied him tensely, then asked without looking away, "Sonny, what is going on?" Sonny lingered for a few seconds, feverishly trying to understand what Mordred was planning. Had he already reclaimed some of his power when they fought several days ago? Had he been pretending to be weak in order to lower Sonny's guard? Had every word spoken by Mordred been chosen carefully in order to manipulate him into doing what Mordred wanted him to do? What was he trying to achieve? Kill Morgan, absorb the essence of the Castellan? Or something else? We are being double-crossed, that is what. Glaring at Mordred, he lowered his empty revolver and asked in a cold, murderous tone, "Let me guess. That whole conversation about wanting to hide your other self on the Ivory Island to protect him from the dream spawn was a lie?" Mordred shrugged with a smile. "Of course. Did you really think I would entrust you with something so vital? To be honest, I never believed that either you or the Changing Star would be able to protect him from that fiend. You know what they say, Sunless? If you want something done well, do it yourself. So thank you kindly for the offer, but I won't be needing your services. We will go our own way, he and I." Sonny smirked. "What? You think that you'll do a better job of protecting him than two sovereigns?" Mordred's smile dimmed faintly. "As a matter of fact, yes, I do believe that. You two have too much to lose, you see, the whole world, really, and that is exactly what the dream spawn will use to destroy you. But me?" He grinned. "I have nothing, and therefore I have nothing to lose." With that, he strengthened his grip on the other Mordred's arm. The other Mordred glanced at Morgan, wanting to say something, but he never did, because in the next moment, he was gone. He vanished without a trace, as if he had never existed at all. Chapter 2544, Mirror Abyss. Where did he go? Effie's tone changed halfway through the sentence as she realized the pointlessness of her question. The answer was obvious. Into the bastard's personal mirror realm, Sonny gritted his teeth. Of course, he had known about Mordred's ascended ability for a long time. It allowed the Prince of Nothing to establish a physical space in the realm of reflections and store objects in it, as well as his morbid collection of vessels. But that was not all he could place into his minor domain. He could pull people into the mirror realm, too. Sonny had been drawn into it once himself, in twilight. He remembered it vividly. The vast and somber expanse, a gray sky covered by stormy clouds, white mist swirling around his feet, and a radiant sphere shining like a pale sun above, its rays falling like silver pillars through the veil of clouds. Mordred's mirror realm was a reflection of his soul's sea, at least it had been when he was a master. Now that he was a saint, his personal mirror realm would have evolved into a minor domain and come to resemble that of Soul Stealer, most likely. He glanced at Mordred with a hint of dark resentment in his eyes. Mordred chuckled. "Yes, indeed. Back when I needed to hide him, all those years back, I was merely awakened. I did not have such a convenient power yet, but I do now. Is there a better place to hide my flaw than my own soul sea? Where would he ever be safer? Nowhere. As long as I keep him imprisoned in my soul, I will always be able to keep an eye on him. So I had to retrieve him from the Palace of Imagination before the dream spawn did it for me." He sighed. "Of course, various obstacles got in the way. I did not expect Morgan to be here and poison the pathetic worm's illusion with her bloodlust. I did not expect such an elaborate illusion to exist either. This place had been quite different when I visited last, you see. Most of all, I did not expect to be stripped of my aspect and be hunted down by the Castellan like a rat. That was quite a troublesome development, to say the least." A pale smile appeared on Mordred's lips. "Ah, but I endured and persevered. You suspected me of being the nihilist Sunless, but of course I did not kill those people, which is not to say that I didn't kill other people." He laughed. "It's just I would never be so careless as to leave bodies lying around. I planned to dispose of them using the drainage collectors at first, but what would you know? There was no need. My victims, unlike those of the nihilists, simply disappeared like mist." Mordred inhaled deeply and glanced at the harrowing vista of the drowned city with regret. "Such a waste. Ah, but no matter. I managed to survive the pursuit of the Castellan, and even recover some of my power. Not enough to unlock my ascended ability, sadly, and not nearly enough to take the axis of this entire world and get out alive. With all my spare attires destroyed, I needed someone who possessed a role in this bizarre world to do it for me, to get me close to my flaw at the right moment. You have my gratitude for that, Sunless." He shrugged. "Oh, and for bringing me all these mercenaries on a silver platter. With their lives and that of Madoc, I finally managed to regain access to my mirror realm. So, this is where we say goodbye, I guess." As Sunny smiled crookedly. "What a polite farewell. Something tells me that this is not how you were planning to part with us, though. You were probably planning to kill us first before leaving to turn the tables and hunt down the Castellan like a rat, instead. However, you failed to anticipate one thing, didn't you?" He glanced at Mordred with a chilling darkness nestling in his eyes. "You failed to anticipate, Saint?" Saint moved slightly at that moment, looking at Mordred with cold, frightening indifference. His smile faltered for a split second. "Why, yes. I loathe to admit it. But I really did not anticipate that your gorgeous companion would turn out to be one of Nether's children. What an ill-fated coincidence, or possibly a fortuitous one, who's to say? Ah, but you are wrong, Sunless." "Hanover." He raised a hand and rubbed his temple, a strange grimace appearing on his face for a brief moment. "I never intended to kill you, Morgan, sure. Raised by wolves as well, to eliminate the risk of her regaining a measure of control over the Palace of Imagination before I escaped it. But even though I would love nothing more than to see you pay for the death of my father, pay terribly, I need you alive." A pale smile bloomed on his lips. "After all, I need you and Changing Star to last as long as possible against the Dreamspawn. The guiding light in the shadow of humanity. You're meant to be my meat shield, you know. What an honor." Laughing, he took a step back. "So live long, Sunless. Live long and struggle desperately. Oh, and by the way—" Mordred made a dramatic pause, looking at him with a smile. That damn miscreant. In the short moment Sunny spent feverishly considering what to do next, Morgan suddenly stepped forward. Her gloves were long gone, and her delicate pale fingers were spread slightly, glistening with the drops of rain like 10 razor-sharp knives. "What? Can't come up with something else to say to stall more." Casting a brief look at Sunny, she said in an even tone, "Take Athena and go find the Castellan, Lord of Shadows. Dr. Saint and I will hold him back." Sunny gave her a long look. Morgan was mundane, and Mordred seemed to have regained the power of an ascended. Challenging him would be absolutely deadly for her, even with Saint fighting by her side. But that wasn't even the main problem. How are you going to hold him back? His dormant ability allows him to jump between reflections. He can slip away anytime he wants. Morgan smiled darkly. He might have regained some power, but he did not regain all of his power. Actually, although he is hiding it, he is barely holding it together, because of the rain. Sunny's eyes widened a little. The rain? Mordred could sense reflections and travel between them, and currently there were millions of tiny mirrors around them. Every drop of rain reflected the world as it fell from the sky, and all those reflections multiplied as they contained each other, creating an endless labyrinth of mirrors. Mordred's mind was constantly assaulted by that boundless abyss of reflections, and even if he attempted to hide it, it must have put an immense stain on him. More importantly, Morgan spoke again. He can indeed escape into reflections, but first he needs to find the right one. That is why he wasted time giving us a winded speech, and that is why he has not escaped yet. So, go. Hurry." Sunny glanced at her, then at Mordred. Mordred smiled. "Ah, my dear sister makes some sense, but you see—" However, he could not finish the sentence, because at that moment Sunny spun around and grabbed Effie, shouting, "Saint!" And a split second later, Saint vanished from where she stood and slammed into Mordred, sending them both crashing into the parapet. Morgan rushed forward as well. Sunny did not see it, though, because he was already running toward the stairs. Chapter 2545, Reflections upon Reflections. Sunny and Effie rushed down the long spiral staircase, jumping over several stone steps with each stride. The great tower shook around them as Mordred, Morgan, and Saint clashed on its roof. Sonny did not know who would win in that fight, or for how long the two women would be able to hold the Prince of Nothing back, so there was no time to waste. Effie seemed to understand that as well. "I just have one question." She failed to make a tight enough turn and slammed into a wall, using it to direct her momentum. "How the hell are we supposed to find the Castellan?" Sonny was cursing the height of the great tower and the length of the stairs when he heard the question. His muscles had already been burning because of the climb-up, and now he had to descend the same way in a rush. Where to find the Castellan, indeed? At the moment he was going over everything that Mordred had told him and trying to understand which of his words were true and which were a lie. Mordred was a frighteningly skilled manipulator, and he knew how to masterfully mix truth and deceit to control his targets. In hindsight, he had to be. Humans naturally rejected anyone who was not like them, and so he would have had to read their thoughts and emotions flawlessly if he wanted to fit in. Even before that, he would have become adept at reading emotions while growing up next to Anvil and Asterion. That said, Sonny did not think that Mordred had lied about countless things here in Mirage City, just about the most important things. That was because he had needed Sonny and Effie to know the true state and function of the Palace of Imagination in order to use them as proxy agents against the Castellan. He had definitely exaggerated how dangerous the Castellan was to anyone who wasn't him, somewhat while at the same time understating how rough a form the Castellan was in. The flood that destroyed Mirage City was most likely a manifestation of that ancient reflection failing to endure the pressure of having to incorporate conflicting desires into its grand illusion without the guidance of the castle master. The Castellan was breaking down, just like the Northern Dam had, and the illusion of Mirage City was breaking down with it. So, where would Sonny find the Castellan? Most of Mirage City was gone now. Only the tallest buildings remained above the water. And the castle, of course. There was a slim chance that the Castellan was in one of the remaining buildings, but Sonny doubted that. No, the ancient reflection would be somewhere here, in the stronghold of its former master. But where? It was not the throne room or the roof of the great tower. It was not the courtyard either. The castle was vast, and there were plenty of halls in it. Sonny glanced at Effie. "You know the layout of Bastion pretty well, right? This replica of the castle seems smaller, but there should be some similarity. How similar are they?" By then they had almost reached the throne room. "Pretty similar." Sonny nodded. "So how would one get to the Great Mirror?" Effie almost stumbled. The Great Mirror? There was the true Great Mirror standing in the middle of the Hall of Imagination in True Bastion. But there was also the false Great Mirror, hidden deep inside the mountain under the illusory bastion. That one the rulers of Clan Valor and later Effie had used to control the component of the great citadel that allowed it to travel between reality and illusions. The false Great Mirror led to True Bastion, while the real Great Mirror led to the Palace of Imagination. But there was a castle in Mirage City as well. So wouldn't it be natural to assume that there would be a third version of the Great Mirror here as well? Just how deep does this infinity mirror go? Effie remained motionless for a moment, looking around with a bewildered expression, then nodded resolutely. "Follow me." They rushed to an alcove behind the throne, where another door was hidden behind a tapestry. The castle itself was a labyrinth, but Effie was able to navigate it with at least some level of confidence. She had been ruling Bastion for more than a year, after all, so this was a replica of her seat of power. Gwent Ensmit, where is it? Where is it? Soon they stopped near an unassuming wall. Looking around, Effie pulled on a metal torch holder fastened to the wall, then turned it slightly. A section of the wall suddenly receded and then slid sideways, revealing a dark passage. Effie smiled faintly. "Still works, however. In the next moment, both of them froze. What is this?" As soon as the secret passage opened, a peculiar sound reached their ears. It was quiet and subtle, as if coming from a great distance, but also impossible to ignore due to how out of place it seemed. Sonny was pretty sure that what they heard was music. It was a clear sound of strings being plucked to sing a haunting, melancholic melody. They glanced at each other, not knowing how to react. "Let's proceed." Effie nodded, just as bewildered and disturbed as Sonny. They entered the secret passage, traversed a maze of dusty stone corridors, and reached a deep well leading to the depths of the mountain. A narrow staircase was clinging to its wall. They descended it without wasting any time, knowing that somewhere far above Morgan and Saint were fighting Mordred with their lives on the line. The deeper into the depths of the mountain they descended, the clearer and louder the forlorn melody became, until it filled their ears completely, making them both feel like they were lost in it. Soon enough, they reached the bottom of the well and found themselves standing in front of towering gates. Sonny held his breath for a moment, then took a step forward and pushed the gates open. Out there behind them stood a vast underground chamber, much too vast for the scale of the mountain, clearly greater than the space it was supposed to take up. An immense mirror was standing in its heart, towering at least 100 meters in height. It was covered by a sheet of thin black fabric, which moved slightly in a ghostly wind, and in front of the mirror, sitting on the stone floor with his back to them, Sonny and Effie finally beheld the Castellan. Chapter 2546, Background Character. Out there in front of the great mirror, a reflection of an illusion of the great mirror to be precise, a man was sitting on the cold stone floor, strumming an old guitar. The slow, wistful melody echoed in the dim expanse of the vast chamber, reflecting from its distant walls. The dead silence that reigned in the depths of the mountain served as an opulent background for the melody, making each note feel full and rich. As Sonny and Effie entered the chamber of the great mirror, the man hummed in a low, pleasant voice. Sonny did not know what he had expected the Castellan to look like. However, he definitely did not expect him to be wearing cheap, torn jeans and a faded windbreaker jacket. The man was sitting with his back to the gates facing the covered mirror, so they could not see his face. However, they did see that his hair was long and disheveled, in dire need of a brush and shampoo. Oh, all of us will dream. The nightmare of the... Sonny and Effie glanced at each other. The Castellan. They were sure that it was him, looked perfectly mundane. He did not show any signs of aggression either, or any signs of having noticed them at all. Instead, he seemed completely focused on casually picking the strings of his guitar and humming a quiet song in the silence of the underground chamber. That song was quite eerie, though. Sonny could not make out all of the words, but they sounded cold and ominous, even if the man singing them did not put any emotion except slight melancholy into his voice. Something about him looked familiar. They moved forward cautiously, circling the Castellan from both sides. When Sonny finally caught a glimpse of his face, he halted for a moment. "I've seen him before." The man was not at all kempt, but his weathered face was handsome, subtly beautiful even. "Wait, isn't he?" Effie's voice sounded surprised. She had a reason to be bewildered, too. Wait a minute. As it turned out, the Castellan had been near them this whole time. Sonny could remember at least 2 instances of meeting him, or rather noticing him in the background. There were probably more that had gone unnoticed. The man was the street musician who had been playing his guitar near the Mirage City Center for Troubled Youths on the day they visited it. He had also been near the psychiatric hospital where Saint worked on the day they kidnapped the other Mordred. In hindsight, his presence in both places was strange. What kind of musician would busk outside on a rainy day when everyone was huddled inside? It made little sense. But Sonny had not paid him any attention. The ragged street musician had been merely one of the many nameless extras populating Mirage City. He had been nothing more than a part of the background. So they had seen him, walked past him, and failed to recognize him for what he truly was. The Castellan, the custodian of the Palace of Imagination and the ancient reflection who had usurped the authority over the great mirror. However, those were not the only 2 times Sonny had seen this man. Effie might have been surprised because she recognized the Castellan as the unassuming street musician, but Sonny had a different reason. In truth, he had seen him even before coming to Mirage City. The street musician was older, and his face was much more weathered. The clothes were different, and his hair was much longer now. The lower part of his face was covered by a beard which had not been there before, but there was no mistaking it. Sonny had seen him in one of the visions bestowed upon him in Ariel's game. He's Omer of the Nine. His voice sounded even. Indeed, the Castellan was none other than one of the Nine, a blind poet famed for his songs, who joined Prince Uri's and the rest of them in the quest to slay the gods. By now, Sonny knew, or at least suspected, what mission some of the Nine had been meant to complete. Aletheia had been tasked with finding the truth in the depths of Ariel's tomb. Abmedon, the sculptor, had been tasked with building a trap for the gods by delivering that truth to the demon of destiny. Orphne, Slayer, had been giver the gravest task of all, to kill Weaver, the demon of fate, in which she had succeeded twice. Uri's had become a slave. And while the details of Oro's mission were still unknown, it was apparently the most distressing of them all. Sonny did not know what task the blind poet Omer had received either. However, he knew that Omer's fate had been to become lost in illusions. Now he understood what that meant. Ren Omer of the Nine had been sent to the realm of Mirage, the demon of imagination. His purpose was unknown, but it had probably been tied to convincing Mirage to answer Nether's call and fight side by side with his siblings in the Doom War. Demons were not the most affectionate of siblings, after all. Nether himself had ignored Hope's imprisonment for 1,000 years. So, if one thought about it, it was actually strange that all of them, all except Weaver, had risen up against the gods together. Some of the Nine must have been sent to other daemons as well, like Omer. As Sonny walked past the Castellan and saw his face clearly, he also saw something far more morbid. In front of the seated man, 14 human eyes were placed in a half-circle, staring at him with glassy pupils. Effie cursed quietly. The victims of the nihilist were all missing their eyes, so that was where the missing eyes had gone. Sonny felt a chill run down his spine. At that moment, the Castellan fell silent and stopped playing his old guitar. He remained motionless for a few seconds, then raised his head and looked at Sonny. His own eyes were clear and blue like the sea. "I am not Omer of the Nine." The Castellan's voice was calm and emotionless. "I am merely the reflection of Omer of the Nine. I am the custodian of the Palace of Imagination." Chapter 2547, 1001. Sonny shivered. It was not every day that he had a conversation with an other. Well, technically, he had conversed with numerous of them here in Mirage City over the last few days, but he had never spoken to one who knew their nature. The reflection of Omer of the Nine? Why was the reflection of one of the Nine serving as a custodian of Mirage's palace? He lingered for a while, then said in a subdued tone, "Well, you haven't been doing your job well, have you? The place is a mess." The Castellan remained silent. Sonny and Effie exchanged glances. Now that they had found the ancient reflection, they were supposed to get the authority over the Palace of Imagination back to Effie somehow. The easiest way would be for her to destroy the Castellan, most likely. But Sonny was not sure how powerful the Castellan was, and therefore whether they would be able to shatter him. Could they convince him to surrender the authority voluntarily? That would be the best outcome, since Effie would be able to use the Castellan to draw much more potential from the Palace of Imagination then. However, Sonny did not know if the reflection of Omer of the Nine could be convinced either. In any case, they did not have much time to try. The Castellan finally spoke. "My mistress is away." This seemed to be his answer to the accusation of not maintaining the Palace of Imagination properly. This reflection had been designed to help the castle master control the Great Mirror after all, not to control it in their master's stead. Effie scoffed. "Who is away?" "I am the master of the castle, and therefore your master as well. Yet, not only did you fail to assist me, you even stole my authority and tried to kill me. No wonder this whole place has collapsed." "Do you see the problem here?" The Castellan stared at her silently. "You're wrong." "He doesn't seem to be blind anymore, at least not here in the Palace of Imagination. Could Mirage have imagined a world where the blind could see?" While Sonny considered that small detail, Effie raised an eyebrow. I'm wrong? What am I wrong about? The Castellan lowered his gaze. I only have one mistress, Mirage, the demon of imagination, and you are not her. The castle you rule is nothing but a shell. The illusory one is the moat, and the true one is the gate. Both merely lead to the palace of imagination, the palace of the demon of imagination. The place where my mistress resided and ruled has always been the Great Mirror. Sonny smiled. The Castellan was mistaken, of course. There had been a time before Mirage created mirrors, so Bastion was far more ancient than the Great Mirror. It did not matter which had come first, anyway. Now that the spell made the castle into a citadel, they were all inseparable. It was interesting that this ancient reflection suffered from such a delusion, though, nevertheless, Sonny had sensed a note of stubbornness in the Castellan's voice when he denounced Effie's claim to authority over the Great Mirror, and proclaimed that he would only ever serve Mirage. It did not feel like challenging his stance directly would be fruitful, but there was also a vulnerability there that could be exploited. Instead of pressing the reflection of Omer of the Nine on this issue, Sonny looked at the covered expanse of the replica of the Great Mirror. Why is the reflection of one of the Nine serving the demon of imagination anyway? The Castellan remained silent for a while. Then he carefully plucked the strings of his guitar. It was because my mistress has become lost in her own illusions. She abandoned the real world, preferring the company of reflections. A fantasy upon fantasy, she lived countless lives in the palace of imagination, not caring about what happened outside its walls, and she was happy. And his quiet melody turned wistful. But what to do? The Nine needed the demon of imagination to join the other demons in their rebellion, and so Omer came to the shores of the Mirror Lake. Who better was there than a poet famous for his tales and songs? Mirage took an interest in him because of how vibrant and inexhaustible his imagination was. And so she invited him into her palace. The Castellan stopped playing and looked into the distance. She gave him control of the Great Mirror so that he could bring his stories to life. Omer created a fantastical realm for her to explore and a thrilling story for her to experience. Mirage enjoyed his fantasy greatly, but eventually she grew bored with it. She wanted to reward the blind poet and send him away, but he offered to imagine another fantasy, and with her permission he did, and then another, and then another. His gaze grew distant. 1,000 realms, 1,000 tales. No matter how much Mirage tested Omer, his imagination never exhausted itself, just like her sense of wonder and hunger were inexhaustible. They experienced 1,000 fantasies together, and when the 1,000th fantasy came to an end, Omer made a request to Mirage. The reflection of Omer put his guitar on the floor. So the demon of imagination gave him a final task. She told him to imagine something that she could not imagine herself. Even I do not know what Omer showed her in that final illusion. But when that illusion was eventually dispelled, Mirage left her palace and joined her siblings in the rebellions against the gods. Omer followed her into war, as well. The Castellan looked at Sonny with emotionless eyes. Only I remained. Sonny smiled faintly. What a gorgeous story it is. But despite the breathtaking story, his voice sounded cruel. Mirage died in that war, you know, and Omer must have died with her. He looked down at the Castellan and said evenly, You say that your mistress is away, but you are the one who lured her out into a hopeless war. You claim to be loyal to Mirage, but you were the one who destroyed her happiness. You killed her. You are a hypocrite, Omer. Ah, I really hate hypocrites the most. Only then did the Castellan's gaze finally show hints of emotion. Chapter 2548, in her image. The Castellan's eyes quaked. He remained motionless for a few moments, then turned his glassy gaze to Sonny. There seemed to be a hint of an emotion hiding behind the cold stillness of his blue eyes, but Sonny was incapable of recognizing what it was. I am not Omer of the Nine. I am the reflection of... Sonny interrupted him. Yes, I know. Turning away, he glanced at the Great Mirror. Now was the time to press the attack and break the Castellan's conception, but he lingered, suddenly distracted by an odd feeling. The great mirror. It was calling to him. It seemed to be exerting a subtle pull on his soul, but apart from that, it was pulling him closer, quite literally. Sonny felt as if the great mirror was a magnet, and his body was made of iron. It was as if his blood pressed against the walls of his veins, pushing him to come closer, needless to say. That was a bizarre and distracting feeling, enough so that he momentarily lost his train of thought. Ah, I see. It took him a few moments to understand what was happening. His blood had a peculiar quality thanks to blood weave. Its parts always strived to fuse back with the whole. That was the reason why he hardly bled, and at the moment his blood wanted to reunite with another lost part. There, behind the black fabric covering the great mirror, another piece of Weather's lineage was waiting for him. I found it. Sonny allowed himself to feel the thrill of having accomplished his goal. He stared at the great mirror for a few moments, motionless, then turned back to the Castellan. His heart was beating rapidly, but no sign of agitation showed on his face. "You are not Omer of the Nine, but you were him once, so is there a difference?" The Castellan fell silent. His gaze remained inexpressive, but Sonny knew that the ancient reflection was troubled. It had already been in a sorry state after being abandoned for thousands of years, slowly coming undone, and now its condition grew even worse because of the clash of human desires it had been forced to endure. It was strange to assume that a reflection had a mental state, but if it did, the Castellan's mental state was weakened. Beastie, the first reflection created by Mordred, had never stopped searching for its sealed master. So the others could feel some emotions after all, or were at least capable of learning to feel them. We shall see. Still conscious of the great mirror behind him, Sonny failed to suppress a question. Glancing at it briefly, he asked in a false tone of indifference, "Why did you cover that mirror anyway? What's behind that cloth?" The Castellan lingered for a while. Eventually he said in an oddly quiet voice, "Something I'm afraid of." Sonny raised an eyebrow. Effie seemed surprised as well. "Afraid of? What can the being in control of the Palace of Imagination fear within its walls?" The Castellan watched the black fabric move faintly in the ghostly wind. His answer was succinct. "Something beyond my control." Sonny frowned. At that moment, a subtle tremor shook the great underground chamber. Streams of dust fell from the ceiling, and with them a few drops of cold water. The Castellan did not seem to react to it in any way, but Sonny and Effie felt differently. Ga avovesh. There's no time. Sonny had to break the Castellan's resolve rapidly, or if that failed, help Effie destroy him. He opened his mouth, wanting to continue his mental assault, but at that moment Effie suddenly walked over to the sitting reflection, knelt beside it, and put her hand on his shoulder. Looking into the Castellan's eyes, she then said, "Hey, you know, I'm no stranger to seeking escape in fantasies. In fact, I spent most of my life endlessly imagining wondrous things, being healthy, being strong, being able to move, not being a burden. Spent numerous days dreaming about being free. I imagined it so vividly and so often that, at times, I was almost able to believe that it was real." Effie smiled, and then slowly, it did become real. "I was able to make all my fantasies come true, one after another. But imagination is indeed inexhaustible, and so I imagined new things. I imagined a world where my children would be able to thrive, one that they would not want to escape as desperately as I had wanted to escape mine. I am still working on making this particular fantasy come true. My imagination is my greatest source of inspiration." She glanced at the Castellan and shook her head. "But what have you, the faithful servant of the demon of imagination, done with yours? Thousands of years have passed, but you haven't managed to imagine yourself as anything other than what you were. You imagined nothing. You haven't changed at all. You put your mistress to shame." Effie gripped the Castellan's shoulder and said quietly, "Mirage is gone, and she is never coming back. Now you have a choice. You can decide what you want to be without her. Will you imagine yourself as someone new, or will you betray her memory by remaining the same? The choice is yours, but I really hope that you will choose the former." I hope that you will help me make my fantasy come true." She looked at him with an earnest expression, and meeting her gaze, the Castellan seemed to hesitate. He remained silent for a while, looking into her eyes with a lost, weary expression. Sonny remained silent and entirely still, afraid to distract the ancient reflection from making a decision. And he could feel it. Sonny could easily imagine that the Castellan would make the right choice. But just before he did, something glinted in Effie's eyes and then reflected in his. A second later, the Castellan shuddered. Chapter 249. Eye of the Beholder. Effie frowned, sensing that something had gone wrong. She let go of the ancient reflection's shoulder and drew her hand back. "What?" Sonny just barely had time to grab her and pull her away before the Castellan's body was contorted by a strange convulsion. His glassy eyes opened widely. And then a vast flood of white mist suddenly exploded from his body in all directions, drowning the vast underground chamber. Suddenly, Sonny could not see anything except the milky white mist swirling around him like a ghostly ocean. A familiar sense of his very being collapsing into nothingness washed over him for a brief moment, but then Sonny forcefully asserted his existence and pushed the feeling back. "Concentrate on your true name. Will yourself to remember who you are." Effie must have done as he told, and her willpower must have been sufficiently firm, because she seemed to regain her bearings just a few moments later. For a few long moments, nothing seemed to exist in the world, except for the ghostly fog and the feelings of the two of them holding each other. All sounds had disappeared as well, muffled by the white mist. Sonny glanced around, full of dark anticipation, and then a disembodied voice resounded in the silence, enveloping them like a tide. "Ah, what a strange sensation. I've never taken a reflection as a vessel before. It feels so odd, but also oddly fitting." The voice laughed, full of amusement, but Sonny did not share that feeling. Instead, he was full of worriness. Mordred, that bastard? It seemed like Mordred had escaped from Morgan and Saint. After all, he had found the right reflection to escape to. He must have traveled to the eyes that had been stolen from the victims of the Nihilist, then reflected from them into Effie's, and finally entered the Castellan's eyes from hers. And now he had consumed the Castellan and made the ancient reflection his vessel. Things must not have gone well for Mordred, though, both in the battle against Saint and in the soul duel with the reflection of Omer of the Nine. Otherwise he would not have been talking. He would have already moved to kill Effie and usurp the authority over the Palace of Imagination. And speaking about that authority, the ocean of white mist around them stirred suddenly and then moved, flowing slowly at first, then faster and faster. As if Sonny was to hazard a guess, Mordred was probably in the process of absorbing the essence of the Castellan. Considering how much of the mist there was, it would probably take him a bit of time. And when that time ran out, Sonny decided not to think about it. Instead, he thought about how to deal with the Prince of Nothing. Effie moved slightly, reaching for her gun. "I'm guessing we won't be able to shoot him dead, will we?" Sonny shook his head, and at that moment the disembodied voice spoke once more from the white mist, seemingly coming from all directions at the same time. "What an amusing suggestion, Saint Athena. But I'm afraid I will have to disappoint you. To tell you the truth, you could have probably finished my original body off with a mundane bullet at the moment. It is in quite rough shape after getting to know the Child of Nether better, alas. But luckily I've managed to secure a new attire just in time." An ominous note found its way into Mordred's pleasant voice. "So, I am very curious to see just what this vessel is capable of." Sonny remained calm, thinking. Mordred's new vessel was the body of the Castellan. But the Castellan himself was dead, destroyed in a soul duel. Wouldn't that mean that the authority he had usurped belonged to no one at the moment, then? And since no one was usurping it, wouldn't that authority return to its intended owner? The master of the castle, or rather its mistress, Effie. He paused for a moment and then said in an even tone, "Tell me to regain my power." The white mist was a raging current now, moving around the vast chamber like a powerful whirlpool. Mordred had to be at the center of that whirlpool, straining to absorb the ferocious torrent of nothingness that was pouring into his soul. Effie shifted and glanced at him for a split second, confusion clearly written on her face. Then her eyes gleamed with understanding. She smiled faintly. "Suffering from the lack of potency, huh? Not performing as you used to? Well, Auntie Effie can help with that. You're a sovereign partner, rise and shine, Equilibrio." And as she spoke those words, Sonny swayed and staggered. If not for Effie supporting him, he might have toppled over. Bob?" Suddenly he felt his powers returning to him. Effie did not seem to have regained full control over the Palace of Imagination yet. Or perhaps she was simply unable to wield that authority as intricately as the Castellan had been able to. Therefore, her command had failed to completely negate the laws of the illusion established by him fully, even if Mirage City was already falling apart. But it did negate them to an extent. Sonny was definitely not a mundane person anymore, and he could sense some facets of his aspect becoming unsealed. Not enough to give him his full power by far, but enough to allow his shadow sense to wash over the castle, and that was all that he needed. He had not known it before, but the great tower had collapsed in the fierce battle between Saint and Mordred. The roof of the throne room was shattered, and rain was falling on the throne of Mirage. Sonny could sense Saint there, as well as the broken form of Morgan. She was alive, but grievously wounded, being supported by the taciturn Shadow as they moved through the debris. "Found you." As the white mist in the underground chamber became thin, almost allowing him to see the towering form of the great mirror, and the figure of Mordred at the heart of the fierce white whirlwind, Sonny reached through the shadows and pulled both Saint and Morgan underground. A moment later, they appeared on the stone floor beside him. Morgan staggered and fell, blood flowing from the ghastly wounds on her body. Saint, however, maintained her balance easily. Sonny forced out a smile, knowing that it was all going to be over for them the moment Mordred finished absorbing the ocean of white mist, and nodded in his direction. "Go, drown him in true darkness. Go." True darkness was an enemy of shadows, but it was an enemy of reflections as well, because just like shadows, reflections could not exist without light. Lunged forward at terrible speed, not wasting even a split second to question his words. Her eyes blazed with cold crimson flames, and the white mist parted in front of her. Mordred let out a melodious laugh. How cunning, Lord of Shadows. Ah, but it is too late, much too late. A tidal wave of true darkness escaped from Saint's body, crashing into the white whirlwind. It washed over him before he could even finish the sentence. Effie knelt near Morgan to check her wounds, then glanced at Sonny. "Do you think Saint will be able to destroy his vessel?" Sonny lingered with the answer for a moment. Then he shook his head. No. If she could, he would not have stayed still to meet her attack. But she would be able to buy them some time. Effie whispered something to Morgan, and her bleeding seemed to slow down. She must have regained some of her powers as well, enough of them survive her horrible wounds at least. Something collided with a terrible boom under the cover of true darkness, and the underground chamber shook. Effie cursed. "So, what do we do?" Sonny stayed silent for a few long moments, looking into the darkness with a tense expression. Chapter 2550, Broken Illusion. The great mirror was truly enormous, and although the sheet of fabric covering it was thin, it was still incredibly vast and heavy. So, he needed Effie's Herculean strength to pull it off the hidden surface. They pulled as hard as they could, and the fabric moved slowly at first, and then faster and faster. It rippled and fell, slowly revealing the silver surface of the great mirror. At that moment there was another deafening boom, and Saint's body flew out of the pool of true darkness, trailing drops of blood behind it. Sonny acted before he knew what he was doing, stepping through the shadows to catch her. He slid a few meters back, holding her petite human form in his arms, and then gently put her on the floor. A suffocating sense of anger rose in his chest. "I'm glad that this bastard is nearly immortal. He won't die, so I'll be able to torture him endlessly." The white mist was entirely gone now. To his left, Effie dashed back to escape the vast black shroud of the falling mirror cover. To his right, Morgan slowly rose from the floor, her scarlet eyes burning with a sharp intent. Right in front of Sonny, some distance away, Mordred slowly walked out of the darkness. He glanced around with an easy smile, then swept the Castellan's disheveled hair back and looked at his hands. What a curious vessel. Its nature is almost perilous, I think. Oh, but this won't do at all. Suddenly the figure of the Castellan grew blurry and changed, transforming into Mordred's own appearance. Reflections were transient beings, after all, capable of changing into anything facing them. Mordred seemed to have mastered that aspect of his new vessel rapidly. When he turned to Sonny, his amicable smile suddenly felt dark and sinister. Now, where were we? Oh, yes. All of you owe me something, and it's time to collect. Let's start with eliminating the usurper who had stolen Bastion from me. He threw a murderous look at Effie and took a step forward. But then his expression changed. The billowing black shroud finally fell to the floor, revealing the vast expanse of the great mirror. And what reflected on it? Sonny looked up, shivering, as a pale smile appeared on his lips. Out there, on the surface of the great mirror, all of them were reflected clearly: Sonny, Effie, Morgan, Saint, and Mordred. But none of it mattered, because there was another reflection trapped in the gigantic mirror, cast by nothing. A dark figure that towered at 100 meters height, looming above them all like a nebulous deity. It wore a tattered black mantle, standing with its back to the vast underground chamber. But as the black shroud fell, the figure moved faintly and turned, casting its frightening gaze at the 5 mortal ants far below. Rado Yurs, its black wooden mask, was snarling ferociously, and there was nothing but darkness nestling in its eyes. 3 horns rose above its head like a jagged crown. Weaver. It was a reflection that the demon of fate had left in the great mirror of the Palace of Imagination thousands of years ago. As Sonny's eyes gleamed with awe, Effie paled and took a step back. Morgan let out a groan and collapsed to her knees, shutting her eyes and covering them with both hands. Saint shuddered on the floor. Mordred remained motionless for a long moment, and then slowly turned to face the great mirror. What the hell is this? He looked up to behold the reflection of Weaver, and as he did, his face became twisted by an expression of utter terror. Mordred raised a trembling hand, as if trying to hide himself from the demon's distressing gaze. But he never did, because in the next moment his body simply exploded into a cloud of glass shards, obliterated on the spot by the mere pressure of Weaver's presence. Ha! Witnessing a demon's reflection was already terrible enough, but Mordred had not just seen it. Since he possessed a sense that allowed him to perceive reflections, he had no choice but to perceive the reflection of Weaver in all its unfathomable immensity. And that alone was enough to destroy his vessel, which failed to endure the strain. The bastard might have even died, although Sonny doubted that very much. Mordred had probably retreated somewhere in terror to hide and lick his wounds. But Sonny had no time to think about that. He stared at the reflection of Weaver, entranced, and then took an unconscious step back. As he did, his own reflection overlapped with the reflection of the demon of fate. And when it did, the surface of the great mirror rippled. A moment later, only one of the 2 reflections remained. Sonny blacked out. A few hours later, Effie and Morgan stood on the wall of the castle, looking at the turbulent waters of the lake beyond. The rain had finally stopped, and the sky cleared. Not that it brought them any relief. Mirage City was gone, and the sky itself was cracked, slowly crumbling as the ancient illusion crumbled. The world seemed to be ending, but the silver moon was still slowly rising into the shattered sky. At this speed, this entire place will cease to exist in a few days. Morgan turned slightly when she spoke, then nodded. What kind of illusion will you create in its place? Effie lingered for a while. I am not sure. Something to prepare Awakened for challenging nightmares, I think, or for waging large-scale wars against the nightmare creatures. We will have to wait and see. I don't think it will be as elaborate as Mirage City, though, after all, I am not a reflection of a genius storyteller that had existed for thousands of years. Morgan nodded again, then looked to the side. There, the body of the Lord of Shadows was sprawled on the battlements, with Saint standing guard above it. She frowned. Why is he still unconscious? And what actually happened there in front of the great mirror? Effie looked at Sonny, too, then shrugged. Well, he seems to have gobbled up a reflection of the demon of fate. Just another Tuesday for him, surely. Don't worry, though, he'll come around eventually. That guy won't be brought down by something as frivolous as a sinister demon. Morgan stared at her incredulously for a while, then sighed. Well, if you say so, not that I care too much. Anyway, our ticket out of here has arrived. She pointed to the lake in front of them, with dark edifices of drowned buildings rising from it like gravestones. Out there, on the dark surface of the still water, the reflection of the moon was shining with pale silver light. Effie grimaced. So we are swimming again? She shook her head dejectedly, then took off her shoes and looked at taciturn Shadow. Saint, you do not look so good. Let me carry him. Saint seemed to be struggling, indeed. It was not because of the wounds she had received in the battle with Mordret, rather. It was because of the strain of forcefully suppressing her evolution to remain by her master's side. Still, instead of letting Effie carry Sonny, she silently leaned down and picked up his unconscious body herself. Effie smiled. Well, all right. In that case... With that, she climbed onto the parapet of the castle wall and looked at the distant reflection of the moon. Let's go home.
Cake.
Somewhere in the eastern quadrant, a convoy carrying the refugees to a port city was scattered across the desolate wasteland, with numerous vehicles overturned or letting out pillars of smoke. If they had only made it to their destination, they would have been safe. Out there in the waters near the city, the night garden was resting on the waves, and everything in its sphere of influence was safe from the horrifying threat of the Skinwalker, for now at least. Soon Soul Reaper and her gigantic ship would have to return to the Dream Realm to replenish the great Citadel's reserves of essence, but the convoy had not made it to the destination. Instead, it was ambushed by the vessels of the nightmare creature, and was now nearly destroyed. People said that the Skinwalker was on the verge of an evolution. Possibly they were to become the last sacrifice to fuel its descent into the status of a profane deity. The survivors had retreated to the head vehicles, desperately trying to fight the vessels of the Skinwalker off. But it was hopeless. They were already surrounded, and the nightmare creature had already taken several of their most powerful warriors. Now those warriors were a part of the Skinwalker, helping the other vessels break the resistance of the last group. Stay strong. Don't let them get close. Don't let them touch you. An ascended officer tried to rally his soldiers, but in the next moment, an arrow pierced his enchanted armor. The Skinwalker had been learning to use human weapons as of late, which only made it more lethal. But now the vessels of the eerie abominations showed more coordination and discipline than seasoned human troops washing over the continent like an unstoppable plague. The Ascended let out a groan and fell to one knee, looking up to see the vessels of the Skinwalker closing in on the group of refugees from all sides. One of them was already right in front of him. The creature looked like a human, and had been human once, but now it was impossible to mistake it for a person. Its gaze was too alien now that it had cast away pretenses, too eerie, too harrowing. The Ascended bit his lip and prepared to end his own life. It was better than becoming one of these creatures at least. But then something strange happened. The vessel of the Skinwalker flinched and then shuddered, bending down in a violent contortion. It trembled for a second or two, then grew still. Something similar was happening to the other vessels as well, spreading among them like a peculiar infection. "What?" Gritting his teeth. The Ascended picked up his sword and staggered back to his feet, preparing to make his last stand. Then the vessel of the Skinwalker in front of him straightened and looked around with an aloof expression. Finally, glancing back at the Ascended, it lingered for a moment and then offered him a friendly smile. "Ah, the weather is wonderful today, isn't it? What a day to be alive." The stranger chuckled as the rest of the Skinwalker vessels around them fell to the ground, then slowly rose again, all wearing the same smile. "Off you go, then. Do not fret. I will take it from here. There is nothing to worry about." End of Part 2, Mirage City Noir. Chapter 255-1, Fragments of a Broken Soul. A vast and somber expanse of white mist sprawled beneath a bleak, stormy sky. The surging storm clouds were heavy with rain, ready to explode with thunder and lightning. The sea of white mist was restless, flowing on the currents of ghostly winds. Pale light was suffusing the clouds and pouring onto the misty sea below. There, in the tempestuous sky, 7 radiant spheres were shining like suns, their cold rays falling through the tears in the veil of the storm. It seemed as though vague symbols were carved into the surface of the pale suns, hiding beneath it like shadows. A man was sitting on the surface of the sea, surrounded by mist, looking up at the silent tempest. The surging clouds, the rays of pale light, and the 7 radiant spheres reflected in his eyes as if in a mirror. His gaze was solemn, and his expression was distant. He was Mordred, the fragment of Mordred who had spent most of his life in the Palace of Imagination, living among people who he knew were no different from illusions, in a world that he knew was a mirage. Now, even that mirage had been taken from him, and he found himself imprisoned here in the hidden heart of his twin brother's mirror realm. Looking at the raging clouds, he sighed. This mirror realm was vast and nebulous, reflecting the tumultuous world back upon itself. However, its very heart, the place he was inhabiting, was different. It was hidden deeper and defended better, isolated, like a fortified inner keep behind the walls of a great fortress. It did not reflect the world. Instead, it was a reflection of his brother's soul sea. There was a living space set up for him here. It was sparse and pragmatic, but also not without a note of fancy. His brother must have collected various items and amenities in preparation for their eventual reunion in the span of countless years. Some of them were opulent and luxurious, worthy of belonging to a member of the most affluent legacy clan. Some would fit a mundane soldier better. There was a modest manor with a tastefully decorated back garden standing in the mist. There was a massive military APC and camp kitchen set up in the mist nearby, as well as several alloy water tanks. There was a vast library full of books, writing and calligraphy utensils, elegant tea sets, and a large storage of varied food supplies. There were paths to take walks with various curios placed in the mist along them, rock formations, sculptures, and relics found in remote regions of the dream realm, strange machines and mundane artifacts from Earth, towering carcasses of fantastical nightmare creatures his brother must have slain, and much more. Mordred was discovering new things every day. It was a bit of a letdown compared to his previous lifestyle, but he was comfortable, if a little lonesome, for now. After all, his brother did not have time to visit at the moment. The raging clouds, the restless currents in the sea of mist, the powerful winds that blew across the vast expanse of the mirror realm as if trying to tear it apart. It was not how things were supposed to be. Instead, it was a sign that his brother's soul was under assault. He was at war, fighting for his life. Even the innermost part of his mirror realm was in a tumultuous state, its walls trembling, so there was no saying what kind of fury and devastation was reigning outside. As Mordred glanced up, subtle cracks appeared on the surface of one of the 7 suns. Malignant tendrils or revolting darkness spread in those cracks, marring the radiant surface of the sphere and consuming it from the inside like a tumor. Before too long, the light of the soul core dimmed, and it came to resemble an appalling, diseased star that seeped grotesque, black tears. A moment later, the soul core shattered like glass. A rift opened in the sky, and its shards were forcefully expelled, taking the mass of spreading darkness with them. The winds howled and the mist surged. A twisting white pillar ascended into the sky, connecting the vast sea with the furious tempest above like a twisting tornado. As more mist poured into the clouds, a new, pristine soul core was slowly formed to replace the shattered one. That was a reflection of his brother's soul becoming infected with corruption. He had torn one of his soul cores out, callously mutilating himself to prevent the corruption from spreading. Then, using the vast reservoir of power he had absorbed after slaying the Castellan, he created a new one. This way, the Prince of Nothing saved himself, but it was of little use. because before too long a different soul core dimmed, rotting with vile darkness. That one was shattered and expelled as well, and a new one eventually took its place. The somber expanse of his soul sea reeled, the white mist surging under the assault of cold winds. This was not the first or second time Mordred had observed the terrifying spectacle transpiring in the sky above him, and it wasn't going to be the last. This battle had been going on for days. For now, his brother was managing to balance the price of continuously sacrificing parts of his soul to carve out corruption, but how long would it last? He had gained a great deal after absorbing the essence of the Castellan, but that stolen boon was not endless. The sea of mist was overflowing for now, but it already seemed thinner than it had been before. Mrbyo. What would happen when it vanished entirely, revealing the still water beneath? What would happen when Mordred saw a flawless reflection of the tempest above on the placid surface of his brother's soul sea? What would happen when even the storm clouds vanished? He was worried. He was restless. He wanted to help. But what could he do? Mordred was merely an awakened after all. Even then, he had lived most of his life as a mundane human. The scope and terror of the battle happening outside the walls of his comfortable shelter was far beyond his ability to comprehend, let alone affect. He was of no use to his brother, to anyone. Taking a deep breath, Mordred finally glanced down. Then he closed his eyes and concentrated, a resolute expression appearing on his face. Nothing happened for a long while, and then a tiny tendril of white fog slowly rose from the surface of the misty sea, being drawn to him by some invisible force. Some time later there was another. Soon enough, dozens of thin streams of white mist surrounded him, being slowly absorbed into his body. Mordred was not at all as capable as his powerful, terrifying brother, but at the core of their being, they were the same person. So he could become someone capable as well. Chapter 2552, King of Nothing. The Eastern Quadrant had been one of the 4 great strongholds of humanity once. It was perhaps not as large and populous as the Northern Quadrant, but hundreds of millions of people still called it home. Now, mere years after Antarctica had fallen, Australia itself was on the verge of being consumed by the powers of corruption. The difference between the two was that while the Southern Quadrant had fallen to an endless flood of monsters birthed by the chain of nightmares, the Eastern Quadrant was being devoured by a single insidious nightmare creature, the Great Terror, Skinwalker. Of all the horrors brought to Earth by the nightmare spell, this one was perhaps the most harrowing, not because it was the most powerful, but simply because it could mimic human behavior almost flawlessly and blend in with mundane people without raising any suspicion. And even worse than that, the Skinwalker had shown a frightening ability to learn and adapt with terrible speed. Its first appearance had gone unnoticed, and by the time the powers watching over humanity learned of its existence, it was already too late. The Skinwalker had infected countless cities in the Eastern Quadrant, embedding its vessels among the mundane population, the awakened warriors, the government forces, and even the private armies of the local legacy clans. There were few of these vessels at first, maybe because the nightmare creature was biding its time and learning the ways of humanity before starting to spread like a plague. Some of them were eventually hunted down and destroyed, but not all of them. Even if the sovereigns reigned supreme, they could not fight a nightmare creature that they could not find, and their forces had been pulled away to fight an internal war regardless. By the time the original sovereigns had fallen and Changing Star of the Immortal Flame took the throne of mankind, it was already too late. Humanity managed to prevent the Skinwalker from spreading to other quadrants or consuming the human settlements in the Dream Realm, but the sinister fiend became too deeply rooted in Australia. A single settlement fell first, all of its citizens becoming vessels of the eerie nightmare creature. Then another one, and then another one still. Before too long, the whole quadrant had been washed over by the spreading plague, and a full-scale war against the Skinwalker commenced in earnest. That war was not going well for the humans. The Eastern Quadrant siege capital still stood, and they still controlled most of the coastal area facing the Indian Ocean. However, the inner expanse of the continent and its southern reaches were fully conquered by the Skinwalker. and almost every day the Great Terror took more lives, gained more vessels, and conquered more land. The spread of the horrid plague seemed unstoppable. The humans were slowly retreating toward EQSC, losing one city after another. In fact, they had not been routed entirely, only because Changing Star herself took to the battlefield as often as the laws governing the waking world allowed her, pushing the Skinwalker back from time to time. But even with her support and with the best saints of humanity joining the war effort, the nightmare creature continued to spread. Eventually it became clear that the continent could not be saved. So, a grievous decision to evacuate it was made, and the Dream Gate opened in the heart of EQSC to take the refugees away, the naval convoys arriving to ferry them north. The arrival of Soul Reaper Jet and the Night Garden helped stabilize the situation. A fragile balance was achieved in the eastern quadrant for a short while. The Skinwalker had taken millions upon millions of vessels by then. Among them were millions of humans, both mundane and awakened. But there were millions of lesser nightmare creatures from the wild reaches of the continent as well. No one really knew how many vessels the nightmare creature possessed now, and even if someone did, there was no way to defend the vast expanse of the continent from that terrible, ever-growing force. And worst of all, both the academics and the diviners in the service of the human domain were unanimous in their suspicion that the Skinwalker was on the verge of evolving either to the cursed rank or to the Titan class, or perhaps both. If it did, neither Soul Reaper nor the Night Garden would be able to hold it back anymore, and the entire population of the Eastern Quadrant, including the military forces of humanity concentrated there, would be consumed without having time or opportunity to evacuate. The situation was dire, and it was in that dire crisis that something odd began to happen. There were isolated reports at first, then a wave of them, all saying the same things, that the Skinwalker was behaving strangely, as if something was attacking the terrifying nightmare creature from within, fighting for control of its vessels. That something was Mordred, the Prince of Nothing, the banished son of the King of Swords, the traitor to the fallen clan Valor, and the executioner of the House of Night. Mordred had gained a lot in the Palace of Imagination, even if he lost a powerful new vessel of his own at the very end. He managed to retrieve his only weakness and escape the wrath of the Lord of Shadow relatively unscathed. However, that was not enough. Not nearly enough, considering what was coming and how little time he had left to prepare for the approaching calamity. So he decided to play one last, desperate gambit, something for which he had been preparing for a long time. He, who was nearly immortal, put his life on the line and left himself no way out but success. Mordred challenged the Great Terror to a soul duel. There, in the dreadful darkness of the Skinwalker's profane soul, surrounded by the unfathomable expanse of corruption, Mordred fought the eldritch nightmare creature tooth and nail, not holding anything back. His own soul was mangled and poisoned, but he tore pieces of it out and continued to fight. And in the process he did something else, his own daring, impossible act of defiance. Ever since becoming a saint, Mordred had been struggling to maintain his sense of self, unwilling to become a demented and broken thing like the Soul Stealer. He limited the use of his transcendent ability to only separating himself to inhabit a handful of vessels, a dozen or two at most. Now he abandoned all caution. Mordred needed to splinter a fragment of his soul to create an independent incarnation. So now he shattered himself into a million pieces. He, who had always dreamed of becoming whole again, tore himself apart completely. That was the only way for him to defeat the Skinwalker. Because with each vessel Mordred stole from him, the power of the eerie fiend lessened a little. In a sense, trying to keep his shattered self from crumbling was as difficult as battling the Great Terror. No, maybe more so. That was the limit he had to overcome. Mordred's and the Skinwalker's horrid, relentless, unseen battle lasted for a long while. Hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks. Each of his soul cores had been destroyed and reforged anew countless times. The pool of power he had absorbed in Mirage City slowly exhausted itself and then ran dry completely. That was when Mordred finally broke through his limit. He destroyed the Skinwalker and took over all of its vessels, millions of human vessels and millions of nightmare creatures. And somewhere along the way, Mordred became the seventh sovereign born from humanity, and the third one to attain supremacy without the help of the nightmare spell. However, his domain was unlike those of the other six. That was because Mordred had no citadels, no territories, and no subjects. His reign was not founded on anything, and he ruled nothing, only himself. With his millions of vessels, Mordred was like a nation in and of himself, self-sufficient and self-reliant, depending on nobody, beholden to nothing. With no weaknesses the Dreamspawn could exploit. As the sun rose above the devastated eastern quadrant, the world welcomed a new sovereign. Of course, his emergence caused a great stir among other powers governing the dying world. Now, unexpectedly, they needed to decide how to deal with the new king. The King of Nothing, Chapter 2553, a monster with 10,000 heads. The graceful silhouette of the Ivory Island drifted among the clouds above Bastion. Contoured against the golden sun, it glanced breathtaking and peaceful from the ground. However, the atmosphere within the walls of the Tower of Hope was far from tranquil. In fact, it was tense and somber despite the suffocating power of the 5 people gathered in a spacious council room on one of the great pagoda's 7 floors. Sunny, Nephis, Cassie, Effie, and Kai were seated around a table, wearing grim expressions. Cassie was talking, and the more she said, the heavier the mood in the room became. Sunny heard each word clearly and grasped their meaning flawlessly. At the same time, he found himself getting distracted as his newly altered mind spread far and wide, absorbing thousands of different perspectives with the same degree of focused clarity. It was an odd state of being, and one he was still failing to get used to. The reason for his current state was, of course, the fragment of Weaver's lineage he had collected in the Palace of Imagination. Mind Weave. No wonder I was out cold for so long. The 4 previous fragments had put him out of commission for a short while and caused him indescribable agony. Absorbing and assimilating them had been a torment, but the Mind Weave was different. Perhaps it was because it had altered his mind on a fundamental level, or perhaps it was because the suffering had been too great to endure even for someone as used to pain as Sunny, but he simply passed out as soon as Weaver's terrible reflection fused with his own. So, he did not remember experiencing any pain at all. That was a wonderful boon, without a doubt. However, Sunny had remained unconscious for 2 weeks as a result. The chaos his absence had caused was significant. The conquest campaign in the burned forest had almost collapsed. The restoration of the Dark City had fallen behind schedule, and the numerous projects he had been busy with had stalled. Nothing he couldn't salvage had transpired, luckily, but there was plenty of catching up he had to do. If there was one silver lining that had come out of this mess, though, it was that Nephis seemed to have thawed after their recent spat. In fact, she was more attentive to him now than she had been before, albeit in a subtle way, which secretly pleased Sunny a great deal. The body of a sovereign was enormously enduring, meaning that a few weeks of coma were not going to harm it in any way. So Nephis had not really nursed him back to health. But staying by his unconscious body for many days, not knowing when his condition would improve, must have rattled her quite a lot, or at least forced her to put things into perspective. No, not even an unconscious body with Sunny out cold. His incarnations were released and reverted back to being independent shadows. That must have been even more difficult for Nephis to endure. As a result, the distance between them disappeared, almost making it seem like there was no disagreement between them. Almost Sunny sighed faintly. In any case, he did come back to his senses eventually, and when he did, the world was quite different from how it had been before, or at least Sunny perceived it differently from how he had before. The difference was so startling, in fact, that he had spent a few more days entirely disoriented. It was difficult to describe the tectonic shift that had happened to him with words. Mind Weave did not exactly make him smarter, wiser, or more intelligent. However, it did increase the volume of his mind immensely, making it seem almost limitless. Sunny was not unfamiliar with this trait, since he had achieved something of the sort himself over the years. First learning to perceive and process the world from both his own point of view and that of his shadow, then slowly expanding the scope of his mind to encompass all of his incarnations while at the same time learning to cope with the increasing reach of his shadow sense. Later, still, his mind expanded even more, adapting to receive sensory input from all the shades of the Shadow Legion and every member of the Shadow Clan. Sonny had always perceived what transpired around them passively. Most of the conduits of his perception simply blended into the background, but he could bring dozens of them to the forefront at will, even hundreds, if he really tried. He had thought that to be quite an accomplishment at the time. Now that he had mind-weave, though, he felt that his previous achievements were merely child's play. As soon as Sonny regained consciousness, he had been assaulted by a crushing avalanche of sensations. The strangest thing, however, was that he had not felt crushed. Instead, he was suddenly able to clearly perceive and concentrate on each of these sensations, as if he was a mythical monster with 10,000 heads and 10,000 arms. Or would that be 20,000 arms? In any case, Sonny had been quite startled, and ever since he often found himself getting distracted, but also not distracted at all. It was not that he could not concentrate on something while concentrating on 1,000 other things at the same time. It was just that he sometimes failed to put meaning into any one point of view, while simultaneously perceiving countless the rest with the same intensity. His mind was drifting. Was this how gods felt, I wonder? Only on a much, much vaster scale. There were benefits to having a mind spacious enough to encompass limitless inputs, of course. Sonny's control over the Shadow Legion had increased tremendously, for example. His ability to envision and execute impossibly complex and intricate patterns while weaving had taken an enormous leap as well, so much so that it felt like he had been crippled before, and was only now experiencing weaving as it was meant to be. He could pay much more attention to each member of the Shadow Clan, too. Wet nobe. But, still, Sonny was somewhat uneasy. He was having a bit of trouble maintaining his former way of thinking in this new, startling reality, and he was not sure that he was meant to. Sonny felt more distant from the mortal man he had once been now, and that feeling slowly grew. But wasn't that exactly what Yuri's had told him had to transpire as one approached apotheosis? Talking to Nephis, and especially Cassie, had helped him somewhat. Both of them were experiencing their own version of that strange process, albeit not quite on the same scale. Nephis because of her domain and the sun god's lineage, Cassie because of her aspect and attributes. But it was still a big adjustment to make. Oh, and he had been quite busy ever since regaining consciousness, putting mind-weave to the test. Sonny? He remained motionless for a few seconds, then raised his head and looked at Cassie. Yes, I am listening. She lingered a little, then nodded. As I was saying, the investigation into the Church of the Moon has produced quite concerning results. Let me share the report. Chapter 2554, Info Hazard. Sonny had been able to sense what his other incarnations were doing in Mirage City. Similarly, his other incarnations had been spectators of his strange adventure. Therefore, the information shared by Mordred reached Nephis and Cassie almost immediately after he himself received it. The news of a supposedly immediate threat posed by Asterion was not a great shock, even if they had to reevaluate how hazardous he truly was. In truth, both Sonny and Nephis had a feeling that they would have to confront the Third Sovereign sooner or later, so they had taken steps to prepare for his eventual emergence. Mordred's warning came mere days before their own network caught the traces of the dream spawn. In fact, if not for the chaos caused by the winter solstice, they would have received the report containing the first clues even earlier. But now that they knew what they were looking for, the investigation had been accelerated. The members of the Shadow Clan, although few in numbers, were spread all across both the waking world and the dream realm. Similarly, Cassie had her own network of informants, some of them voluntary, some unknowing, and kept an eye out for anything strange. The first strange thing that had led to concerning results was one of the countless spreading cults, the Church of the Moon. The cult began quite innocuously. Its members are in the habit of joining merchant caravans and offering blessings for safe travel, blessings of the moon. Not beast god, though simply the moon. What is strange about the Church of the Moon, however, is the speed with which its following grew. Cassie paused for a second and gestured to a paper report compiled by Aiko. People of the Nightmare Spell era are usually not easily led astray by superstitions, even harmless ones. But the followers of the moon gained recognition both quickly and widely. It is still quite a minor sect, all things considered, but there lies the problem. She frowned. After noticing the suspicious pattern, we used the government personnel to run an analysis on the other minor cults in the database. The results are quite worrying, to say the least. There are at least half a dozen similar sects spread around the world. They are in each of the 3 quadrants, the basin of the River of Tears, as well as the former territory of the Sword Domain. And these are only the religious cults. Cassie's expression darkened. There might be other unassuming groups loitering on the edges of society, criminal gangs, private clubs, black market enterprises, and so on. At the moment, there is no way to tell how countless people exactly are. Let's call them sleeper agents, for now. Kai, who had been listening to her quietly, asked in a concerned tone, "How have we not noticed them before, and, even if they are indeed secret followers of that man, the Dream Spawn, what does that entail exactly? What do they do? What has raised our suspicion apart from an abnormal rate of growth?" Sonny smiled darkly. "That is the question, isn't it?" Cassie let out a sigh. "The second question answers the first. What do they do? Ostensibly nothing of any importance." "That is why we have not discovered anything suspicious about them sooner." Effie raised an eyebrow. "If they have done nothing wrong, how do we know that they serve our favorite scarecrow, Mr. Lunatic?" Cassie lingered for a few seconds. "I said that they have done nothing of importance, not that they have done nothing. From the outside, their activity seems quite benign, if a little misguided, offering blessings, giving troubled people a sense of community, and holding sermons from time to time. However, once we dug deeper—" She paused, then sighed again. "Well, really, we still did not find anything sinister. At most, some members of these sects are guilty of minor vandalism, or agents could not discover more because they do not know what they are looking for. But when I took a look personally and concentrated on the areas where the members of these cults are active, I saw something eerie." Cassie paused, then continued in a grim tone. "Those minor acts of vandalism were mainly things like painting graffiti on the walls of various buildings. And those graffiti all contain the name I'm not going to say aloud, the name of the Dream Spawn." Effie glanced at her, then at Nephis and Sonny. "Do their paintings possess some kind of beguiling power? Are they using runic sorcery, maybe?" Cassie shook her head. "The graffiti possess no power. They are just mundane drawings. The name itself, however, the name itself does." Kai frowned. "What kind of power can a name possess?" He paused for a moment and then added in an embarrassed tone, "I'm sorry I misspoke. Names obviously possess power. There are true names and shaping, after all. But I don't think you meant that kind of power, Cassie. So, what can the Dream Spawn's name do?" Genobek Cassie remained silent for a while, then said with a subdued expression, "It has the power to spread." She lowered her head and exhaled slowly. "Once someone learns that name, it seems to take root in their mind. Then they start mentioning it from time to time without even realizing. And while that in and of itself does not seem too worrisome, the frightening part is that the name spreads like a virus. Anyone who hears it becomes a carrier as well, and therefore helps it spread further." Her expression turned grim. "We caught it early enough, so the virus has not spread too widely yet. This is the good news." She did not seem too happy, though. Cassie lingered for a few seconds, then added evenly, "The bad news is that there are no countermeasures. We can destroy the graffiti, but the Dream Spawn's name has already been seen or heard by countless people, and we can't destroy people. Or rather, we won't. There is no way to identify all of the hosts, anyway." Nephis nodded silently. Cassie turned her way briefly, then said, "More than that, although I compared the Dream Spawn's name to a virus, it is not in the traditional sense. It is an idea that acts as a virulent virus, and therefore there is no cure that we can come up with, no vaccine, no easily reproduced way to treat the infected. She fell silent for a few seconds, then sighed heavily. So, even though we caught it early, there is no way to stop it. The rate with which it spreads will grow exponentially. Cassie faced them then and said in a grave tone, "It's a pandemic." Chapter 215-555, Nameless Menace. A heavy silence settled in the council room. No one spoke for a while, considering her ominous words. Eventually Effie leaned back and rubbed her temple. "How troublesome," she sighed. "What about us? We all know his name. Are we infected as well?" Cassie shrugged. "It is difficult to tell. From what I have been able to observe so far, not everyone is susceptible to his influence equally. The more powerful a person is, and the more mental fortitude they possess, the less frequently they mention the name, which can be seen as them resisting infection. However, there is a difference between resistance and immunity. We also don't know if they are resisting the infection itself or merely a symptom." Effie grimaced, dissatisfied with the answer. "And that's the problem, isn't it? We just don't know enough. We hardly know anything, really. Keysong and Anvil were too thorough in eradicating any and all knowledge about the dream spawn from the world. Hell." She glanced around the room and said in a somber tone, "We don't even know why his name being known to people is dangerous. Does the dream spawn draw power from those who are infected by the idea of him? Is he rebuilding a foundation of his domain that way? What happens when the virus reaches critical mass?" Effie shook her head. "How are we supposed to fight an enemy we know close to nothing about?" After another bout of heavy silence, Kai spoke in a hesitant tone. "Still, how dangerous can that man be?" "Sure, he is a supreme inheritor of a divine lineage, possibly even several of them, if Mordret is to be believed. But he is not a wielder of a divine aspect, unlike Nephis and Sunny. More than that, he has been sealed on the moon for 2 decades. It is already a miracle that he has survived for that long. So how powerful can he still be?" Even though the question was not directed at Sunny, and his flaw did not force him to answer, he still answered, "Let's not get careless. It does not matter how powerful we are. Power is merely a weapon. And just like a weapon, it won't save you unless drawn and pointed at the adversary." Truthfully, Sunny did not think that Asturion could contend against him and Nephis in terms of power, either of them, let alone the 2 of them together. However, raw power was not a universal answer. One had to express the power they possessed shrewdly to make use of it. Even then, one moment of complacency could spell disaster. And further still, there was always someone or something that countered your aspect in the vast and harrowing world of the nightmare spell. A bad matchup could bring down even the strongest beings, awakened and nightmare creatures both. Sunny knew all this better than most, because he had triumphed over innumerable foes who were far more powerful than he and should have utterly crushed him. So he was not going to underestimate Astarion, especially not after seeing how spooked Mordred was by his former caretaker. Calling the Dreamspawn his guardian would have probably been too big a stretch. Sadly, that did not change much in the current situation. Effie frowned. "So what now? What can we even do?" Cassie remained silent for a while, then said, "One option is to do what Keysong and Anvil did. Find a way to identify everyone infected by the Dreamspawn. Then cull them all. Naturally, that would be a slaughter of horrifying proportions." Nephis shook her head. "No." He looked at them and said in her even dispassionate voice, "We are not going to slaughter thousands or possibly even hundreds of thousands of innocent people. If we do, we would be no better than Song and Valor. What was the point of overthrowing them then?" Sunny studied her silently, behind Neff's calm facade. She was actually a person burning with passion, more than anyone he knew, possibly. Nephis wanted to conquer all nightmares and destroy the nightmare spell with a passion so ferocious that it bordered on obsession. So it was easy to overlook the rest of her behind that blazing ambition. But Nephis herself was never blinded by her incinerating desire, even though she was pursuing it with obsessive persistence. For her, the end never justified the means. Sunny had learned it numerous years ago, near the crumbling gateway of the Crimson Spirit, that Nephis did not simply want to destroy the spell, but also did it in a way that she considered right, without compromising her values. It was just that her personal sense of right and wrong was so peculiar that most people often failed to recognize her intentions. Sunny knew, though. So he knew that Nephis would never order a massacre of thousands of innocent people to prevent her enemy from growing stronger. She might send them into a bloody battle against a tide of nightmare creatures, since that would fit her understanding of what was right and righteous. But she would not simply sacrifice them to further her goals. That conviction was what made her so strong, but it was also something she lacked when compared to Anvil and Key Song, a limitation that, if exploited, could be turned into a weakness. Was that what Mordred meant when he said that we have too much to lose? Sunny was troubled. The dream spawn has not even revealed himself yet, and it already feels like our hands are tied. Nephis looked at him briefly, then sighed. There are still initial steps we can take, to learn more and hopefully work out countermeasures based on that information. She remained silent for a while, contemplating, and then turned to Cassie. Cassie continued to monitor the Zealots and broaden the scope of the investigation to include other marginal groups. Request as much resources as you must, conscript the entire intelligence arm of the government if need be. Additionally, I need you to pay a visit to Godgrave and have a conversation with the disgraced patriarch of the Dagonet clan, Saint Jest. Sunny nodded quietly. Old Jest had outlived his king and was now living in exile, confined to a remote citadel in Godgrave with the other staunch loyalists. If anyone knew about Asterion, it would be him, after all. He had been the most loyal enforcer of the great clan Valor. He would have certainly learned a lot about the members of his young master's cohort. Whether Jest would be willing to talk was a question, naturally. But Sunny had no doubt that Cassie would succeed in getting valuable information out of him. She could be quite persuasive when she wanted to, after all, and if that did not work, she could simply plunder other people's memories. Nephis turned to Kai. Morgan is back in Ravenheart, isn't she? Speak to her as well. Anvil had probably been wary of exposing her to knowledge about the Dreamspawn, considering how dangerous it is, so she would not know as much as Jest. But she can still know something. She also unearthed a part of the secrets left behind by Kisong Seishan, too. Learn all you can from them. A strange shadow ran across her face. She lingered for a while and then looked back at Cassie. Oh, and get me the casualties list among our awakened warriors. Everyone who fell in battle ever since the war. Sunny raised an eyebrow. What's that for? Nephis remained silent for a while. Her face did not show any emotion, but he could tell that she was troubled by something. Eventually she said, all of humanity, most of it at least, is encompassed by my domain. I can feel the longing of billions of people day and night, washing over me like an ocean tide. Sometimes too often to count. I can vaguely feel their radiant sparks being extinguished. That means that one of my subjects died. The flame of their desire is gone forever. Her expression grew a little wistful. I've been sensing more and more people dying as of late. The increase in the mortality rate was not significant, so I assumed that it was just the natural course of things after all. War is raging on all sides. A war to subjugate new regions of the Dream Realm, a war for the Eastern Quadrant. Numerous people have become refugees and settlers, too, and their lives are far less stable than before. Nephis frowned. But now, I think that there might be a different cause, so I want to check. Kai looked at her in confusion. A different cause? You suspect that the Dreamspawn's followers are responsible for these deaths? Nephis slowly shook her head. No, I suspect that these people, some of them at least, might not be dead at all. There is another reason for me to lose the ability to sense someone's spark after all. It is if they have ceased to be a part of my domain. Sunny blinked a couple of times, meaning that they became a part of someone else's domain, like the members of the Shadow Clan, who could not enjoy the grace of Neph's flame due to bearing his mark. He scowled. Do you mean? But before Sonny could finish the sentence, Cassie suddenly flinched. Her eyes widened a little, and she turned to them with a complicated expression. Wait, there is a message from Jet. Cassie paused for a moment, and then said in an urgent tone, Something strange just happened in the Eastern Quadrant. Chapter 255-6, The Sovereigns. A desolate wasteland was basking in the blinding light of high noon. The sun was like a small silver coin in the azure sky, melting as its rays bathed the world in heat and radiance. The shadows were small and formless, hiding under the rocks and rusting carcasses of ancient war machines. 3 colossal gates towered above the wasteland, facing each other. Each formed an apex of a triangle, and there was considerable distance between them. One of the dream gates was dark and nebulous, rending the world like an inky black rift. The second one was pure and radiant, shining like the sun. The last one was like a mirror, reflecting the wasteland back upon itself. No one was here, in the ravaged heart of the Eastern Quadrant, to witness them. No one except for the millions of figures who stood still under the cruel rays of the blazing sun, covering the wasteland behind the mirror gate, like a vast sea. Some of them looked like humans, while some glanced like nightmare creatures. Naturally, all of them were a single being, Mordred, the King of Nothing. As the sun moved across the azure expanse of the boundless sky, the shadows slowly crawled out of their shelters. The darkness of the shadow gates seemed to flow forward, too, then. It surged and swelled, and a tenebrous legion rose from its lightless depths. Tens of thousands of shades marched onto the wasteland, with several titanic figures lumbering among them like dark giants. The Shadow Legion assembled into a flawless battle formation, facing the King of Nothing and his myriad vessels silently. Finally, a sole figure appeared from the Sun Gate, landing on the ground in front of it like a radiant spirit of pure light. Her radiant wings folded and her luminosity dimmed, revealing ivory skin and hair that was like a torrent of liquid silver. Regarding the sea of vessels with an aloof expression, she took a step forward and walked to the center of the triangle formed by the 3 dream gates. Of course, she was Nephis of immortal flame, changing star, the ruler of the human domain, and the guiding star of humanity. Almost at the same time, a figure rose from the shadow of the second gate. It was a young man with porcelain skin and raven black hair, with eyes so dark that they almost seemed like 2 glistening onyx gemstones. He was sunless, the Lord of Shadows, the Sovereign of Death. He headed to the center of the triangle as well, and everywhere he passed, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, and finally a third figure appeared out of the rippling silver surface of the mirror gate. It was a tall man with a slender figure and peculiar eyes that reflected the world back upon itself, wearing the tattered remains of a stylish Viridian suit. Smiling easily, he folded his hands behind his back and went to meet the other 2 sovereigns. He was Mordred of Nowhere, the King of Nothing. Slightly past noon, the 3 demigods met on the scorched sands of the barren wasteland in the Eastern Quadrant. Sonny was the first to speak. He studied Mordred for a few seconds, then looked at the millions of motionless vessels behind him and smiled darkly. My, oh my, I did not think we would meet again so soon. I guess congratulations are in order. Mordred looked a little eerie, really. There had always been something subtly unnerving about him, a vague sense of wrongness caused by the absence of something that all humans were supposed to possess. But now, a new layer of inexplicable strangeness was layered on top of that. It was as if Mordred was even less related to anything human than he had been before, as if he was a myriad of broken shards that had been a person once hiding under human skin. Why, thank you, Sunless. Mordred smiled and inhaled with a full chest. Ah, it feels good to be king. In an utterly unnerving display of unity, the millions of vessels behind him all smiled at the same time. Sonny struggled to maintain a composed expression, feeling a cold shiver making its way up his spine. Never thought there would come a day when I'll see nightmare creatures smiling. Granted, their attempts at mimicking Mordred looked more like frightening snarls than the pleasant smile playing on his lips. Nephis spoke at that moment, her even tone showing no sign of being disturbed by the eerie scene. You should be feeling it by now. the laws of this realm rejecting you, pushing you out. So let us not waste time on meaningless pleasantries and get to the point." She was right. Staying in the waking world for a short while was not impossible, but they were weakened here. More than that, it was straining. The longer Sonny lingered, the more the pressure on him mounted, and the harder it was to push against the walls of the world that seemed to want to crush him. It was easier to do for Nephis, who shared an inherent connection to both worlds, but only relatively. All that meant was that she could return more often and stay for longer, not that she wasn't affected in the same way. Actually, there was no telling what relationship Mordred had with the waking world. The war realm. After all, he had inherited the lineage of War God, and more than that, his powers had to do with mirrors. As someone who reflected the world in front of him, he could possess an inherent advantage when it came to adapting to its laws. And again, he could be having it as rough as Sonny. Mordred chuckled. "What is the point, Changing Star? Are you two going to attack me?" Nephis stared at him evenly. At first glance, it looked like they had gathered here to fight. However, the millions of vessels, the Shadow Legion, and the 3 Dream Gates. It was all just for show. A statement of their power and a silent reminder of what would happen if they were to clash. In truth, the continent would probably not be able to endure the dreadful forces unleashed by a battle between 3 Supremes, and with its fall, the entire ecosystem that allowed humans to survive on Earth would inevitably follow. That was why they had chosen to meet here, in a place that rejected them and suppressed their power. When Nephis did not respond, Mordred smiled. "I thought not. A wise decision. After all, there is no reason for us to become enemies." Sonny glared at him silently for a few seconds. "Tell that to the survivors of the House of Night, bastard, and to the countless people who suffered when the naval navigation in the waking world all but collapsed in an instant." Mordred considered him for a short while, then grinned. "The proper address is Your Royal Majesty, King Mordred? Not bastard. Please have some decorum." His expression suddenly turned pitiful. "And if I might add, is it not in bad taste to call someone a bastard after having made them an orphan? Ah, how callous, how cruel." He let out a laugh and then looked at Sonny with an amused smile. "As for the House of Night, what exactly am I being accused of? What happened was their own fault. The elders of the House of Night could have submitted to the song domain of their own free will and become honored vassals of the Queen. Instead, they chose their own pride and arrogance. They committed the gravest sin of all." Mordred's gaze turned cold. They were weak and tried to hold on to something that they couldn't protect in a world that doesn't tolerate weakness, let alone arrogance. So they brought it all upon themselves. He shrugged. "Plus, I merely removed the elders, or rather replaced them. There was some collateral damage, naturally, but most of the ascended and awakened members of the House of Night, the actual Nightwalkers who guide the ships across the ocean, survived." Mordred sighed. "Ideally, I would have accepted them back into the fold after the war. The House of Night would have become the House of Nothing, with little disturbance to the infrastructure of the waking world. Even the power of the saints would not have been lost, since I'd be wielding it. So don't paint me as some kind of mad monster." He smiled. "I am a very reasonable monster, if nothing else." Sonny glared at him darkly. "Ah, how aggravating." He couldn't even erase that irritating smile from Mordred's face. Nephis finally spoke, breaking the tense silence between them. "I've been told that trying to make you regret your actions is a meaningless endeavor, Mordred. So I won't try. However," she looked at him calmly, "the 3 of us are supreme. I do not want to repeat the mistakes of the previous generation and embroil humanity in another civil war. We, sovereigns, must find a way to coexist, instead of fighting each other. I doubt that you want to be destroyed. And since you have attained supremacy without the help of the nightmare spell, there is no reason for us to fight for territory either. So, let us negotiate." Mordred studied her for a few seconds, then smiled. "Ah, finally, a civil discussion. Goodness gracious, how refreshing. Sure, Changing Star. Let us negotiate indeed. Chapter 2557, Lesser Evil. Sonny did not like the idea of negotiating with Mordred at all, not because he was particularly inflexible and wanted to kill the bastard no matter what, although the idea of cleansing the world of Mordred did seem amazingly alluring, but simply because he knew from experience that striking any kind of deal with Mordred was a dangerous gamble at best. The chances of being betrayed were too high. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice. Wait, how many times have I been fooled by this damned miscreant? He frowned, then looked at the sea of motionless figures standing behind the mirror gate. A chill ran down his spine again. Sonny had felt an inexplicable sense of unease ever since beholding the eerie sight of this silent myriad. Truth be told, he did not even know if the Mordred he knew and the creature standing in front of him were the same being. By now they knew that Mordred had attained supremacy in the process of battling the Skinwalker in a soul duel. That was how he was able to inhabit millions of vessels and destroy the Great Terror. Granted, even Cassie was not clear on which came first. The cause and the result were too closely intertwined to be discerned. Perhaps in this case they were one and the same. Regardless, Mordred had somehow managed to manifest a domain encompassing no one but himself, which went against the very idea of supremacy. The authority of a sovereign was supposed to be expressed by exerting it upon something, after all, be it living beings or territory. Even that was not a problem, though. The problem was just how many vessels Mordred now possessed. It was simply beyond the realm of reason. If Sonny did not confirm it himself, he would have confidently stated that it was completely impossible. He knew the pressure of trying to separate his mind across tens of thousands of conduits better than most, after all, and his shades weren't even true incarnations. He could only perceive the world around them and issue commands, not control them directly as he would his own body. Even that had put an enormous strain on him before he acquired Mind Weave, and mere weeks after acquiring Mind Weave, he was already struggling with maintaining his previous sense of self. All that stemmed from having to split his attention between every shade of the Shadow Legion, and Mordred possessed millions of vessels, not merely thousands. Even Kisang had not been able to control such a staggering number of puppets. Even Soul Stealer, a version of Mordred twisted by corruption, had been driven mad by shattering himself into a million pieces to consume Twilight. But Mordred did not seem mad. At least he was not madder than he had been before. He did not seem quite human either, though. The face was the same, if made even more sublime by the rebirth of rising to a higher rank, and the manners were the same, too. But there was something unfamiliar hiding in the depths of Mordred's gaze. How would having millions of bodies change someone's consciousness? Especially if that someone had a tenuous claim to personhood to begin with. Sonny did not want to show the subtle feeling of being disturbed by this new and unfamiliar Mordred. One thought disturbed him even more, though. Is something similar happening to me and Nephis? It was an eerie thought. In any case, as much as Sonny did not like the idea of negotiating with Mordred, they had little choice. Despite all his deviousness and complete lack of remorse, Mordred could try to downplay the hideousness of the massacre he had perpetrated upon the House of Night all he wanted, and it would still not convince anyone. He was a sovereign now, and a sovereign could never be treated lightly, least of all one wielding a divine aspect. Sonny and Nephis could probably destroy him and his millions of vessels, but they would not escape that battle unscathed. At best, they would be severely weakened, which could prove fatal before too long. There was another sovereign they had to worry about after all. There were 4 supremes in existence now, and one of them was almost certainly both hostile and a dire threat. So, as long as it could be avoided, they had to make sure that Mordred joined the battle against Asterion, and, ideally, the war for the future of humanity, on their side. So it was not just that destroying him would cost them too much. They had little reason to destroy him, to begin with, or at least more reasons to keep him alive than to kill him, as long as Mordred could be reasoned with, and as much as Sonny wanted to deny it, Mordred had told them the truth. He was a very reasonable monster indeed. He had betrayed and fooled Sonny a few times, but he was not a pathological schemer. He had fulfilled his promises quite faithfully when it suited him. In the tomb of Ariel, for example, He had played a key role during the final battle at Verge, a battle in which Sonny himself had not participated, having betrayed and abandoned his friends. Damnation. It's driving me insane. Sonny looked at Mordred's side and asked in a resigned tone, "What exactly is it that you want?" He had an idea. Mordred had already expressed that he needed Sonny and Nephis for no other reason than to be his meat shield against the Dreamspawn. Now that he was the king of nothing, that seemed like more of a strategy than before, for no other reason than the fact that a sovereign could contend against Astarion, while a saint couldn't. At least Mordred had not seemed to believe that he stood a chance. Neither had he believed that Sonny and Nephis stood a chance. Therefore their usefulness as cannon fodder had an expiration date. That, in turn, would mean that Mordred expected Astarion to defeat them eventually, and therefore had to have a plan for what was going to come next. Now the outline of that plan was starting to take shape. Mordred was going to attack. The world, even two worlds, seemed to be too small for two supremes, as long as one of these supremes was Astarion. So, Mordred had to have an intention of destroying the Dreamspawn eventually, not only because he believed that he would have to in order to survive, but also because he hated Astarion almost as much as he had hated the King of Swords. He just needed Sonny and Nephis to buy him time. Mordred smiled. "What do I want from the two of you?" "Well, in one word, nothing. Absolutely nothing." He laughed. Chapter 2558, Mirror Domain. Mordred's laughter echoed above the wasteland. Then it suddenly turned into a haunting, deafening roar that was because the millions of vessels behind him all laughed as well. That scene was so otherworldly eerie that Sonny could not help but grimace. "Cut the theatrics, will you?" Mordred chuckled once more, then looked at them with a faint smile. The sea of motionless figures behind him grew still as well. Nephis shook her head. "Saying that you don't need anything from us is a bit of an exaggeration, isn't it?" She looked behind him at the horde of vessels, some of them human, some of them monstrous. Among the humans, there were a number awakened, but most of them were mundane. They were the ordinary citizens of the Eastum Quadrant, taken by the Skinwalker in the past, only for their bodies to be stolen by Mordred in the end. If nothing else, you will need a place to settle. Now that these vessels belong to you, they will be banished from the waking world before too long. And every area of the dream realm that is not a death zone currently belongs to us. So, unless you want this sea of vessels to tum into a shallow pond, you will have to find a place for them to live." Mordred let out a wistful sigh. "A place to call home, is it? What a wonderful sentiment. Why, this is indeed something I would not refuse. So, how about you give me the Storm Sea?" Nephis tilted her head a little out of the question. It was indeed impossible for them to surrender the Storm Sea to Mordred, not only because there were 24 citadels there, almost half of them conquered by Mordred while impersonating the elders of the House of Night, but it was also the connective tissue between the former territories of the Song and Sword domains. Except for the Road of Shadow far north. In Godgrave, it was the only way to travel between the two parts of the human domain, unless one made use of a dream gate opened by a supreme who ruled Night Garden. Mordred sighed. How disappointing. And after I spent so much effort conquering those citadels, no less. He shook his head, then smiled. "You seem to think that you have the upper hand in these negotiations, Changing Star. But let me remind you of something. In truth, I don't really need a region of the Dream Realm to settle my vessels. So you have nothing to offer me. Your hand is empty." Nephis frowned and studied him for a few moments. "The Mirror Realm." Mordred chuckled. "Indeed. You do remember after all. In fact, Sonny remembered too. It was just that neither Mordred nor Nephis remembered that he had been there with them as well. It had happened back in Twilight, when Mordred pulled them into Soul Stealer's Mirror Realm. His own only encompassed the reflection of his Soul Sea at the time, but the minor mirror domain of Soul Stealer encompassed the reflection of the entire city. Now that Mordred was supreme and his domain had fully manifested, there was no telling how vast and lifelike his mirror realm was. Vast enough for millions of vessels to inhabit, perhaps? I'll be damned. Mordred was not just a one-man nation. He seemed to be carrying an entire kingdom within himself as well, and every mirror could become a door to that kingdom, a door that only he could open. Nephis shook her head. Most of your vessels are fragile and mundane. They will need to be fed, sheltered, clothed, and cared for. Even if you have a space to store them, you won't have the resources to keep them alive, not without vast hunting grounds and trade routes. Not to mention that you will want to expand your domain by usurping more bodies. No. No, Beige, she smiled faintly. You are not reckless enough to plunder my people, so you will have to hunt down nightmare creatures. Therefore, you will still need a territory to call your own. Mordred sighed. Goodness, fine. I will admit it. I do indeed want to control a territory in the Dream Realm, but not just any territory will do. Something was telling Sunny that Mordred would not demand to receive Bastion. What piece of land does he have his eyes on? Mordred believed that Astarion was coming, and that the human domain, as well as the shadow domain, would eventually fall into his hands. He was also prepared to wage a war against Astarion and destroy him. So, in other words, Mordred was preparing to wage war on the human domain. Just not yet, not while it still belonged to Nephis. This insane bastard. In that light, it made a lot of sense why his first choice was the Storm Sea. If one wanted to launch a military campaign against all of humanity, there was no better option. Not only did the Storm Sea wash over the southern shores of both human enclaves in the Dream Realm, it was also nebulous and difficult to navigate. With his knowledge and experience of sailing its misty waters, Mordred would be able to launch unexpected attacks all along the coast, as well as use the estuary of the River of Tears to advance north rapidly, almost all the way to Ravenheart. He would also be able to storm Rivergate for the second time and reach Bastion in a matter of days, if not hours. Best of all, he would be able to retreat into the mists of the Storm Sea after each raid, saving himself from Astarion's retaliation. The House of Night had existed for so long without being protected by a sovereign in large part because invading the Storm Sea was an inherently dangerous endeavor. It was almost impossible to conquer it unless you felt at home in its deadly, nebulous waters. It was a perfect fit. So perfect, in fact, that Sunny could not help but suspect that Mordred had always kept the eventual return of the Dreamspawn in mind, and aimed his sights on the House of Night in large part for that very reason. However, it was for that reason as well that Nephis and Sunny would never let the newly risen Supreme usurp the Storm Sea. What other region of the Dream Realm could compare, though? What other place could serve Mordred's goals? Sea smiled. Give me the Hollow Mountains, then. Chapter 2559. Uneasy Alliance. Mordred wanted the Hollow Mountains. Well, it was no surprise that he did. All the reasons why the Storm Sea suited his goals applied to the Hollow Mountains as well. The mountain chain stretched from east to west, bordering the human territories on both sides of Godgrave. The endless expanse of white mist shrouding the jagged peaks made it all but impossible to invade them, while those who could survive its cold embrace were free to launch unexpected raids on the lands south of the mountains, or north of them. That was where the Forgotten Shore, Sunny's lightless kingdom, was located. In addition to that, Mordred had an affinity to the source of the white mist, to nothing. So he would have an easier time surviving there than almost anyone else. Of course, his aspect had to do with mirrors and reflections, which were kin to nothing creatures, but not exactly the same thing. In a sense, the Hollow Mountains were to Mordred what the Shadow Realm was to Sunny, perfect hunting grounds that were as full of promise as they were perilous and deadly. Granted, that only encompassed the surface of the hollow peaks, not the dark depths inside them, the underworld. Out there in the realm of true darkness, Mordred would be just as helpless as Sunny. After all, there could be no reflections without light, so his powers would be rendered useless. Mordred seemed to be getting exactly what he wanted. However, Sunny and Nephis had no reason to refuse him, or at least no reason that was good enough to deny him the Hollow Mountains. They themselves had no use for them, and there were no human colonies being built within the mist. All in all, things could have been worse. A new sovereign had risen from the ranks of humanity, and while he was not exactly a reliable ally, he was not inherently hostile either. Mordred might have been a monster who knew neither regret nor remorse, but he did not usually act without reason. Otherwise, it would have been the entire population of EQSC consumed by him instead of the Skinwalker. On the bright side, humanity had another supreme now, and an immensely powerful one at that. If there was one predictable thing about Mordred, it was that he always acted in self-interest. And in the grand scheme of things, his interests coincided with those of Sunny and Nephis. After all, the destruction of their world was imminent. Once Earth was fully consumed by the Dream Realm, everything that was not corrupted would be besieged by the nightmare creatures, including those fallen deities of the cursed and unholy rank. When that happened, Mordred would have little choice but to fight side by side with other human sovereigns in order to survive. Sunny understood that rationally. But still, negotiating with the bastard was exceedingly frustrating. I want to rip that damn smile off his face. He had dismissed the Shadow Legion. The endless sea of Mordred's vessels was disappearing into the rippling surface of the Mirror Gate, too. They were entering the Mirror Realm, leaving the desolate expanse of the Eastern Quadrant behind. Mordred himself was still here, though, looking at them with a polite smile. Yes, I do agree. We should continue this conversation in a more comfortable setting. His smile was the same, but his face betrayed subtle signs of fatigue. The war realm was straining to expel them, and by now the pressure was crushing. On top of that, Mordred had only recently concluded the dreadful battle against the Skinwalker and undergone the evolution to supremacy. He had not had the chance to rest and recover yet, so he was in rough shape. The negotiations were far from being over, of course. They had only set out the very fundamental principles of their future coexistence, so the details would have to be decided later, in the presence of people who could formulate a proper treaty. It was not a question of authority, but merely of convenience. Mordred would need building materials and a steady supply of clean drinking water and food to establish his kingdom in the Hollow Mountains, for example, since it was going to take him some time and a lot of effort to make it self-sufficient. Therefore, some kind of trade agreement would have to be established, and Sunny and Nephis were not the best people to define it. There were countless small details like that. There was the question of what they would be getting in return as well. And above all else, they were not going to agree on anything with Mordred unless Kai was present in the room and could confirm that the King of Nothing was being sincere in his willingness to, if not cooperate, then at least coexist with the human domain. On Osh. So he was invited to Bastion. The negotiations would continue on the Ivory Island, with most members of the cohort, as well as a team of relevant professionals present. As for Mordred, he did not have a cohort, close companions, or talented subordinates. Therefore, he would have to oversee the entire process himself. I can believe this is my life now. Sunny blinked a couple of times, thinking that he had never expected to negotiate a trade agreement with Mordred one day. Life was, indeed, full of surprises. They were also going to discuss the dream spawn in more detail then. Granted, Mordred did not seem too keen on the idea of cementing an alliance to deal with Asterion, despite everything. He was entirely convinced that Sunny and Nephis were a lost cause. So he wasn't inclined to help them understand what his former caretaker was capable of. All knowledge Mordred possessed would have to be exchanged for something. That was what Sunny and Nephis were getting in return for building materials and food supplies, above all else. Well then, I'll depart first. Mordred gave them a perfunctory bow and vanished without a trace. His Dreamgate disappeared as well, leaving Sunny and Nephs alone on the desolate wasteland. Sunny studied the landscape around them for a long while, and then suddenly laughed. I realized something just now. He looked at Nephis and shook his head in disbelief. This is now the safest place in the world, both worlds, really. Chapter 2560, Sudden Peace. The Eastern Quadrant had been ravaged by war. The peculiar thing about the Skinwalker, however, was that the Great Terror did not discriminate between people and nightmare creatures. It took every vessel it could find, striving to grow and spread as much as possible, no matter whom it consumed. And while humans were still resisting the dreadful fiend, The nightmare creatures populating the wilderness of the eastern quadrant had all been wiped out and absorbed by the skinwalker some time ago. Their bodies were then inherited by Mordred, who took them into his mirror realm. So, at the moment, the eastern quadrant was the only place in either of the worlds that was completely void of abominations. There were still nightmare gates here, of course, which meant that new monsters would wander through them sooner or later. But for now, this continent was completely safe and cleansed of corruption, like all continents used to be. Nephis remained silent for a while, then sighed. Indeed, it is quite ironic, isn't it? Although his motivation was entirely selfish, Mordred had done a great service for humanity. He saved an entire quadrant. And maybe much more, considering that the skinwalker was on the verge of evolving. Sonny let out a bitter laugh. You are right. He did something that neither of us had managed to do, Mordred, of all people. Nephis possessed great power, but that power was largely straightforward. Sonny wielded a subtler aspect, but he still could not have eradicated the skinwalker without shattering the entire continent. Even then, a few vessels would have survived and hidden themselves somewhere else, so that plague would have begun spreading in a different corner of the world before too long. But Mordred possessed a power that was uniquely suited to destroying creatures of exactly that kind. By challenging the skinwalker to a soul duel, he had destroyed the very root of the Great Terror without the need to annihilate each and every one of its vessels. And now a sudden realization hit Sonny. The war is over. A lion's share of humanity's forces were currently concentrated in the eastern quadrant, mundane soldiers and awakened alike. The same went for saints. Even Jet was here, as well as the Night Garden. Now, all these people had nothing to do. The military forces would have to be relocated to other flashpoints, some here on Earth, some in the Dream Realm. All of this had happened so unexpectedly that there was no plan in place. Many strategic meetings would have to happen to adjust the resources of humanity according to the new reality. There was the question of the evacuation as well. The population of the Eastern Quadrant was currently being evacuated to other quadrants in the Dream Realm. Now the primary reason for that exodus was gone. Were they going to stop the evacuation and abandon plans of leaving the Eastern Quadrant, or continue to ferry people away? The Dream Realm was waiting, after all, and everyone would have to abandon the waking world sooner or later. There were many things to decide. Sonny could already feel his head hurting. Nephis gave him a guarded look, and then suddenly asked, "Do you think that we really are no match for the Dream Spawn, too?" She seemed to be displeased, and somewhat uneasy because of what Mordred had said. Aster, Song, Vale, these were the three names that had defined her childhood. Song and Vale were dead now, but Aster remained more than that. Nephis now knew that, in large part, she survived because Astarion had held the other two sovereigns back and prevented them from trying to dispose of her too openly. Not out of concern for her or some twisted shape of sentimentality, but simply because he had needed her to awaken to harvest the lineage of Sun God. Sonny pursed his lips and considered his words for a while. Eventually, he sighed. The Dreamspawn seems to possess powers that have to do with mind manipulation. Among all the nightmare creatures that I've faced, those that mess with your mind were absolutely the worst, so I do believe that dealing with him will be a troublesome affair. Emil's and Sonny's expression darkened. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we should not be expecting a clean victory, this one. We will have to bleed for this one, I think. He paused, then looked at Nephis and asked, "What do you think?" She studied the desolate landscape around them for a while, then shrugged. "It is, as you said. It will be a tough fight, and we will not win it without paying a price. But we will win it, I believe it." Sonny nodded. "So do I. I don't think it's going to be very pleasant, though." He shook his head dejectedly. What was it with Supremes and fighting each other instead of focusing their ire on the nightmare creatures? Out of the 7 sovereigns born from humanity up to this point, 3 had already perished, and all 3 of them had been killed by other Supremes, not by powerful abominations. Broken Sword, Key Song, and Anvil. Astarion would join them eventually, and by then, not just some, but most human Supremes would have fallen to a human's blade. Children of war, indeed. Perhaps Yuri's had a point in disliking Sonny and his kind. Looking at the oddly tranquil landscape of the eastern quadrant, Nephis inhaled deeply. Perhaps she was thinking about how this was her eventual goal, a world free of the nightmares. Perhaps she was simply thinking about the mountain of decisions she would have to make regarding the relocation of her armies. Turning to the radiant Dreamgate, Nephis looked at her shadow, where a different incarnation of Sonny was hiding, and then back at him. "We should return to Bastion. Are you coming?" Sonny hesitated for a little while, then smiled. "No, I think I'm going to catch a ride with Jet. She is going to take the Night Garden back to Stormsea soon, isn't she?" Nephis studied him for a moment, then nodded and headed toward the gate. "Don't fall into a coma this time, please, if you don't mind." Sonny smiled as he turned the other way. "I can't say that I won't, but I will definitely try."